So today's goal, at least for my purpose for you, is that you'll leave here with a base level of understanding and competence about the subject of ham radio itself, and then the practical uses and the variety of applications, right? So you should have a very general base knowledge by the time you leave here. The idea is that you're equipped to walk out of here and go learn if there's a certain subject you really liked or you think really applies to you more, you'll have the tools you need to go competently learn about that instead of just kind of being a fish out of water, okay? Well, there's no way in a one-day class with total entry-level people we could get to expert level. Your mind would just melt today. There's so much to learn. But I can help you get the basics, and the basics are hard enough as they are. So as any of you probably know, if you've tried to look into this at all, it can be overwhelming. So some of the topics I listed out here, kind of just a general idea of how radio works. We're going to talk about that conceptually, kind of theoretically how it works. We'll talk about licensing. We'll talk about all the stuff, so radios, repeaters, antennas, connectors, cables, power supplies, all that stuff. And then we'll kind of shift gears. Practical applications. How can you use these radios? What are their limits? What are kind of their functionalities? What are some strategies to getting the most out of them in whatever situation you're trying to use them? And then, of course, how to program them. Sounds like some of you have radios. Some of you don't. I'm not going to necessarily spend a tremendous amount of time about programming, but I can help any of you get them programmed. That makes me think, out of all the places you guys said you're from, I think maybe Matthews for you, Joe, that's probably the furthest away. Is everybody else within, say, it sounded like about 15 miles or so, or? 25. Okay, 25 miles? 30 to 50. Okay, 30 to 50. So that's good for me to know if you guys are trying to cover that kind of area. So today's schedule, like I already mentioned, we're going to kind of do the talking part, the listening part, the question and answer part before lunch. We're going to get as much done as we can. And then after lunch, I'm going to show you stuff. We'll program radios. We'll do all the gear-related things and the practical hands-on stuff. As was mentioned, if you have a question, maybe I will give a chance before I advance to the next slide every time. But if you can just let me get through that subject. It's hard enough for me to gather my thoughts to articulate some of this stuff. So just give me a chance to finish the slide, and then I'll always ask for questions. Please don't feel any apprehension about asking a question, however simple it might sound, okay? So anything so far? Anything I can help you guys with you have a question about? All right, so kind of looking at the broad scale of things here, let's think about what ham radio really helps us prepare for. I assume that everybody here kind of has a preparedness mindset, that we've accepted this responsibility, that we understand things are not always going to be available to us that are right now, and that bad things can happen, so we want to be prepared. Communication is pretty cliche as an essential part of life, right? We know in relationships it's important. We know in teamwork it's important. We know in business it's important. Communication is just an essential part of life. We really take for granted how easy it is right now. But under pressure, it goes out the window. So I know I've heard James Yeager say, the first thing to go in a fight is communication, right? So when you're in a gunfight, people just stop talking because they're under the effect of adrenaline. They're focused on the task at hand, and they get tunnel vision. That's kind of at the small scale, but I think even at the big scale, the grand scale of things, if things are under pressure, you think about coronavirus when it first started, all the panic, the toilet paper situation, whatever that is, right? Communication, it gets twisted, it gets noisy, it gets confusing. This is a place we can help with that. So you can have clarity. You can talk to a source you trust. You can talk to a source that is important to you, that you value. this is really the only way to communicate at distance independently. So independently meaning you don't need anything but two radios. If I have a radio and you have a radio and the laws of physics still work, they will work, and it might only work till your battery goes dead. But if you have a way to recharge that radio or spare batteries, as long as you have those two radios, if they worked before the crisis, as long as nothing has happened, and I mean that seriously, right? The laws of physics do have to work. So if there's some sort of event that's occurred that has created an obstacle of some object in your front yard that doesn't let the signal get through, it won't work anymore. But as long as nothing changes physically in the world between you and that person, it'll work. And that's a real miracle, because we're pretty much limited to voice other than that, right? Voice or mail pigeons, I guess, is about what we're down to. So this is a real miracle of communication. Any questions about that? I've got a list here of some gaps it fills. I think this is what I kind of conceptualize of. Here's the applications for ham radio, all right? Everyday life, I love using these radios at home with my wife. We have about 4 acres. If I go outside, I can have a radio on me, and there can be one on the counter in the kitchen. And if I need to get her attention, I don't have to. She doesn't have to have her phone on her. She doesn't have to try to call me. We have a metal roof, and our cell phones don't always work great. It is a perfectly reliable way to just talk. And you imagine if we didn't have cell phones, we're down to opening the front door and yelling for each other, right? That may not be ideal depending on the situation. So everyday life, if you're outside of audible speaking distance, a radio might help. If you operate a business and your employees are, think about like a mall or a car dealership. A lot of people use radios. Churches, if somebody's out in the parking lot doing greeting, they might have a radio. They're very useful, okay? Teams, obviously, if you're thinking tactical type stuff, having a team all on the same frequency, you can talk very quietly but still hear each other. You can talk, at distance if you're not within audible reach, or if that would give away your position to talk too loudly. That's pretty obvious. I think people think about that pretty often. Traveling is one that I love personally. I think super helpful is recently my wife and I had to take a trip with our girls in separate cars because I was taking a class and they were staying at the house we had rented. And so we needed 2 cars so I could go and she would still have a car. So the whole way out to Tennessee, 8-hour trip, we were able to stay in very close touch. Hey, we need to pull over for a diaper change. Hey, we're getting low on gas, whatever that is. Of course, a cell phone call would work. But number one, it's a great way to practice using these radios. And number two, just like at home on the counter, that radio's in the cup holder on the car. I can get to her, she can get to me without any ringing. It's pretty much hands-free as far as you don't have to pay it much attention. You just pick it up and talk. Very helpful with traveling, I think. And then something a little more broad, this broadcast idea. If you need to inform a bunch of people about what's going on, this is a great way to do it, okay? You can independently, if you can't send an email, you can't send a text, you can send a radio call out at a certain time of the day that everyone knows to be listening. So we'll talk about how to prepare for that, but that's certainly helpful for important news, weather, like, hey, there's a tornado over here. If you don't have the weather app on your phone, you may not know that. And just general notifications, hey, there's a suspicious car driving through the neighborhood, heads up. And then, of course, emergency stuff. I've heard stories of people, older folks, who have fallen and literally cannot get to a phone, but they had their radio. They could go on a repeater and say, hey, can somebody call 911 for me? And this is not a grid down apocalypse situation. It's just everyday life, but they fell. They can't get to the phone. Somebody can call for them. You can imagine all sorts of emergency situations where it might be handy. Some not so bad, some really bad, right? So any questions so far? All right. we're going to take a break after this slide, so hang in there. We'll do a short one. If that sounds all right. All right, so let's talk about licensing. This one has already been mentioned. This is controversial depending on the audience. I am a freedom-loving individual. Believe me, I do not love the idea of having to get a license to do anything. So please hear that is my context for this. I'm not one of these folks who's like, yeah, this is no big deal. I don't like it any more than you do. I think it comes down to this philosophy of allowed versus able, just like carrying a gun, okay? I am able to carry a gun wherever I want, mostly, right? Unless somebody's going to strip search me, like really strip search me, I can get a gun anywhere pretty much. But am I allowed? No, of course. There's plenty of places where I am in serious danger of consequences if I do carry that gun, right? Radio's the same way, probably not as dire of consequences, let's be honest, but you are able to use your radio. You bought it, right? You didn't have to have a license to buy it. If you can figure it out, you can use it. You can use it. You can't legally press that transmit button until you have a license. There are a bunch of different bands of radio. CB and FRS, technically you don't need a license for, so these are very limited, and they're not going to give you what you guys are after as far as the distances you want to cover and the versatility you want, but this is an option. If you buy walkie-talkies at Walmart, they're FRS, Family Radio Service, I think is what that stands for. You're very limited on the amount of power you can use, which means you're down to legitimately a few hundred feet on FRS, probably, unless you're on top of a mountain. CB, that's going to be your truckers, that's been around a long time. People love it. Citizens Band Radio, and I think, Joe, you said you had some experience with that. Much simpler, not a lot of distance. There's no community built around repeaters with CB. It's very limited. So that bumps you up to GMRS. That's that third one there in the middle. That one you can actually do without passing a test. You can just get a license for that and use GMRS. But again, you're not going to have the community of repeaters in the area to rely on. You're going to be very limited. So that kind of bumps us to those two on the right, VHF, UHF. That's what you need a license for, and that's the most helpful spot. Is you're going to have a huge network of repeaters. I think there's probably 30 or 40 in this area you could touch, depending on your equipment, that you can then, we'll talk a lot about repeaters, but that basically just amplifies your range beyond what you can even imagine. So that's what you want the license for, is those two bands, essentially. There is a third band that's very rarely used in our area that's in between those also. The crux of the matter is there's about 40 FCC agents that are in charge of enforcing this. That's what I've been told. They typically investigate things where people are causing a problem. Okay, so if somebody's got a radio and they're holding down the button so that emergency services in their area can't use their radios, they're going to go find that guy. They're going to hunt him down and stop him because he's preventing, emergency services. But you having a conversation with your neighbor, if they had 4,000 agents, maybe, but how are they going to hear it? Are they in range to hear it? Maybe if they've got a bunch of listening devices on every telephone pole or something. But honestly, it's probably not a problem as far as worrying about being caught. That's not the motivation in my mind to get licensed, is worrying about getting caught. Okay, I'm going to talk about other motivations though. The biggest two is access to clubs and mentors and practicing. So the ham radio world is set up around having a license. I gave you my call sign, KN4WRX. That is my name in the radio world. That's what everyone wants to know me by. I can't get that without a license. So if I want to talk on a repeater and talk to other people in my area, I have to identify myself. If I don't, they're going to ask for my call sign. I'm not going to have one. They're not going to talk to me. They're serious about this. In the gun world, we'll give this emergency second here. In the gun world, we might call these FUDs, if you've ever heard that term. You know, guys that are kind of back in they're in the good old days. They think all you need is a deer rifle in 1911, and that's anything else past that is unnecessary. Those kind of folks. That is kind of the same mentality in the ham radio world. They're very much rule followers, and if you want access to the very intelligent leadership and mentorship in that community, you need to get a license. They will not help you if you don't, and that's just the fact of it. So practicing is going to be an essential part of this. If you don't use your radio, you will forget how to use it unless you're just a savant with a photographic memory, and chances are you wouldn't be here learning from me if you were that guy. So you need to practice. If you're going to practice, you need a call sign. So my point here is I think you should get a license for that benefit alone. And I'll tell you how to get a license real easy here in a second. Emergency use, you don't have to have a license. So if you fell down and you can't get to the phone, you can call for help on the radio. And you don't have to worry about the police coming to arrest you for a FCC violation. If there's a hurricane, you're allowed to use it for emergency use without a license. Stuff like that. The problem is you won't know how because you haven't been practicing. So not going to help you a whole lot. It's like your teenager that hasn't yet drove a car is allowed to drive the car if that is the only way to get away from the burning building, but they're not going to be too good at driving probably. They might hurt themselves. All right, so a big protest people have about licensing is, well, it's going to publish my address on the internet. I don't want people to know where I live. If you have not, you will know that I'm not right as I'm saying this if you've taken the links to privacy that would be necessary to make sure people can't get your address. But if you aren't confident that you're smarter than me and you already know you're anonymous, I can get your address. You're probably on white pages. You're probably registered to vote. You probably have bought something and had it delivered to your address. Your address is out there, okay? If you're really worried about it, you can get a P.O. box and register under your P.O. box and not use your physical address, or rent a box at the UPS store. That's not a legitimate concern about this day and age. You should be prepared for people to know your address. It's just a fact of life, I think. So unless you are the ultimate gray man and you have from birth spent every effort to make sure you're anonymous, chances are people can get your address. That's not legitimate. So how do you get your license? You go to hamstudy.org or you download the HamStudy app. You take 1,000 practice tests for the technician's license, however many it takes until you pass it. You memorize the answers, okay? You don't try to learn. You're here to learn today. I'm going to teach you more today than you will ever learn trying to learn for that test. That test was built for ancient history, ancient technology, stuff you don't need to know. It's irrelevant. 90% of it has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about today. I'm not going to teach you enough to pass that test today, even if we spent 12 hours here, because it's all stuff that really isn't helpful when it comes to using a radio. That's the sad fact of it. It's basically a way to weed out people that aren't going to put in the effort or aren't smart enough to pass it. That's basically what it's there for. So I recommend memorize, pass, and then proceed. All right, so get it done, renew it when the renewal comes. Don't ever let it expire, and just get on with your life. All right, memorize your call sign. That's the one thing you need to know from getting the test. Now, what I've just said is very controversial, but that's my philosophy. That's what I've told everyone. My little sister, who is not technical in any way, has made it like her little fun thing to do after work is to take 2 or 3 practice tests, and she can pass a test. And she doesn't know anything about radio. She just memorized the answers. What a lot of people don't know is these tests, all the questions are public. So these practice tests are the test. There's a pool of questions that the test pulls from. You can read all those questions and all the answers. There's no change made to them when you take the test. They're identical other than the order the answers are in. So you can't literally remember A, B, C, D. But if you remember the question and remember the answer to that question, you will pass the test. You don't need a perfect score to pass. I think it's 28 out of 35 or something like that. So that's my recommendation to you. I would do that as soon as you can. So get the app, see how good you do just right off the boat after today. Take a practice test. Even if you only get a couple right, at least those are a couple you don't have to memorize. That will ingrain it in your mind as you take those practice tests. It'll immediately tell you, nope, that's wrong. Nope, that's wrong. And it's perfect for learning how to pass it, I think. Any questions about that? I know that's a lot. Go ahead.
Back to the first part up there.
Yep.
VHF and UHF. Is there a Marine?
There is Marine. I believe Marine is not required to have a license either. I don't remember what frequency range. I think it's around the FRS frequency range. I've never been into boats, so honestly I don't know. There is also an aviation band. I think you do get that with your pilot's license or something like that, but they're all very similar. I think most radios we have today can do Marine frequencies. You can program them in with chirp. It's similar to like CB, where it's not intended to be used with repeaters. It's really boat to boat or boat to lighthouse or station kind of thing. But there is a Marine and an aviation band.
So there's no license requirement for that?
I don't believe there is. I'd have to look it up to confirm, but I don't believe Marine requires a license. I think any boat can have that. And it's considered like an emergency use type thing.
And the second question, what is the cost on that ham test? Where do I do it, and how much
Sure.
is the renewal?
Yeah, the cost on the ham test, I don't remember, to be honest. I think it's like $20 or $30. And so you need to, I should have put that on here, I'm sorry, but you probably need to find a local ham radio club. There's a Catawba one that does testing that I'm buddies with some of the guys that run that. I'm happy to point you to that. You can go, I've got the AARL website on another slide here as a resource. That's kind of the granddaddy of ham radio. That'll be a one-stop shop to find out how to find a testing center. But you want basically to find, if you just search ham radio technician's license exam on Google, or Ham Study has some, in coronavirus they actually introduced remote testing where you can do it. They're watching you with like 6 webcams and making sure you're not cheating. But because they weren't allowed to do it in person anywhere, they had to innovate. I think they have a lookup tool on the hamstudy.org website also. But basically a local club is where you need to go to take the test. You'll have to register, you'll have to get what's called an FRN number from the FCC. They'll tell you to do this when you sign up to take the test, but you could go ahead and do that. You go on the FCC website and register, get that FRN number. You will need that to give to your tester so they can grant you the license. It's basically an anonymous way to identify yourself. You register with the FCC and then you just give them that number so you don't register with your tester. It's kind of like a Social Security number, but for the FCC. So your local ham club is going to be a good resource if you have one. And good news is there's a pretty active radio culture in this area. And they do testing, and they'll help you with problems, stuff like that. Okay, welcome back. So we're going to talk about 4 areas that I think for today where radio fits into life and kind of what you need. We'll expand on this. These are just the categories, okay? So first one here is kind of like an EDC, everyday carry radio you can have with you in your backpack, in your car, for just general use. It's going to be a radio with an attached antenna, okay? That's what that is. Now, if you're looking for something more like a bug out or adventure, you're going on a hike or a camping trip, you can add a roll-up antenna to your pack. I got several of them, but here's one with a 16-foot cable. You can throw this up in a tree. We're going to talk about this antenna later, but this will get you some more range, or if you're having a hard time getting to where you need to go, you can add this to your mix, and that will help increase your range. In a vehicle, you're either going to have a handheld radio or a mobile radio, which we'll talk about all this in more detail, but this is a mobile radio. It's called mobile, but it's not very mobile. It's got to be connected to a power supply or a battery. So you'll need one of those, or something with a magnetic base antenna, or a hard-mounted antenna outside the car. Inside the car, you're going to have a similar problem that I have at my house, right? Your car's made out of metal. Metal stops radio waves. So it might work in the car. You might have to hang it out the window and talk if you don't have one of these. But ideally, you need an outdoor antenna on your car. And then the last kind of category is going to be a base station. Now, base station radios are different. You know, that's an official term for a whole category of radio. But what I mean by base station is this kind of like home base. This is a setup. It's not really intended to be portable. It can be moved. Like I brought mine today, but I've got 40 pounds of stuff to move if I move it. But it's going to be a handheld or a mobile radio with a very high mounted antenna. That antenna is kind of permanent, right? It's not going to move with you. That's the idea of that. So these 4 areas are kind of what I recommend that you consider what your plan is. From bottom to top, range goes down. So your EDC radio is going to have the least range. Your base station radio with a big high antenna is going to have the most range. Okay, so the more portable it is, the lighter it is, the smaller it is, the less range it has. Okay, we are used to a cell phone that can do things that 30 years ago were only in science fiction movies, and this thing's tiny, it fits in my pocket, and I can change the world with this sucker, right? Like I can live stream news anywhere in the world with this. That used to require entire satellite infrastructure to be able to do for a news crew that cost millions of dollars. I can do it with a $500 phone now. Radio did not make that same change, so there's no replacement for expensive, power-consuming, heavy, big equipment. It has not shrunk. It's gotten cheaper, and it has gotten better, but it has not changed in the way that most of the things we're used to have. So you kind of have to adjust your mindset. And we were talking on the break about wanting to talk to somebody in Tennessee. If you want to talk to somebody in Tennessee on UHF or VHF, I mean, it might cost you tens of thousands of dollars to accomplish that. You might need 5 repeaters, $3,000 a piece to be able to make your signal travel that far. Or you might have to go lease a property at the top of a mountain to put your antenna on to be able to get that far. It's just, there's no quick, easy way like there is with the internet. So it's important to keep it where it belongs. If this is not going to be your thing, constrain your use case down to the minimum necessary domain, right? Let's shrink it down to as small as it needs to be feasible, because as you grow, it gets more expensive and more complicated. If every 100 feet further you need to go is another $100 probably. I mean, it gets expensive. So just generally about ham radio, yes, it is complicated. That's why none of you guys came in here already knowing all this, and it took me several years to even get to base competence. Unless you are a physics geek or a ham radio geek of some kind, this is just your thing, chances are this is going to be very challenging. That is why most people don't go down this path, because it's confusing, and unfortunately most of the people that know this stuff are not very good teachers. They are kind of geeky, kind of nerdy, kind of just heady people, and they love it, they know all about it, but to be able to talk to the common person about this stuff, it can be done, and YouTube has helped a lot because there's some very skilled people on YouTube simplifying things. But usually people can't simplify it. It's just one of these subjects that's too technical. So today I'm going to try to simplify as much as I can, but you do need a working knowledge of how this works to use it. So this is, again, like your cell phone, you don't have a clue how your cell phone works. I sure don't. All right, I can't engineer a 4G network for my cell phone to work worldwide on. I would have no clue where to even begin. I don't know how it works, but I can use the heck out of a cell phone. So I'm very disconnected from the inner workings, right? I use the front end, the nice pretty app somebody built to check the weather. I don't know anything about Doppler radar and how that connects, but with radio, I would have to know all that to really use it properly, and that's what is such an obstacle in radios. You got to really understand it to use it. So that's what my goal is, like we talked about today, is get you to that base level of competence around how it works. So when you hear somebody throw out a term, you just don't have a clue what they're saying. That's not going to work. So we'll get there today. Any questions about that? All right. So you already use devices every day, most likely, that use RF to communicate radio frequencies. Your car radio, of course, you turn it to 96.9. That is 96.9 megahertz FM frequency. That's a radio frequency. It's only receiving, and it's broadcasting that signal from a radio station, literally, with antennas that shoot it out over the air. But you're used to that. Your doorbell, if it's wireless, probably operates on an FCC-approved frequency. The key fob on your car, an RC car, I know like Simply Safe security systems, it's kind of a vulnerability. They work on a frequency that a Baofeng can use, and so all your sensors, if you want to break in a Simply Safe security house, you can look up that security, you can look up their patent, find that code, take this radio, program it, hold the button down, and open the door, and it won't go off, because this will overpower that very low power sensor. You know, this has 5 watts, it has 1/10 of a watt, but it uses radio. If you used a wireless phone, not a cell phone, but a wireless phone with, you know, the gigahertz rating on it, that's radio. Intercoms, driveway alarms, all sorts of stuff. So you're already using this stuff, you don't know it most likely. For our purposes, ham or amateur radio, those are kind of interchangeable, by the way. It's just a set of frequencies that are set aside for hobby use. So our wonderful government has decided that we're allowed to use these for fun. That's it. That's all it is. There's infinite frequencies in the world, from 0 to several million hertz, and we get a slice of that is set aside for us to use as hobbyists. So, you know, we asked about marine and aviation. They have a set aside frequency range for that. Police have a set aside frequency for them. There's all sorts of business class and all that stuff. Basically what it's coming down to is these 2 bands we've talked about. When we say bands, it's 2 ranges of frequencies that you're licensed to use for hobby use, VHF and UHF. There is a tri-band, which is around 220 megahertz, that you're also licensed for. I'm not going to talk about it because it's not really useful. Some radios will have that, but if you see the word dual band on a radio, that's referring to UHF, VHF. That's what you want. Most likely, unless you have a pretty old radio, it's going to be dual band. And sometimes you'll see them specific VHF or specific UHF, but you want to make sure you got a dual band radio. We'll talk more about that. And the frequency is essentially the channel you're using it on. So if you think about flipping channels on a TV or changing the radio station, frequency means that's the channel I'm on, basically. So kind of use those terms interchangeably. Any questions about that? Okay, so this slide is wrong on yours. You're going to have to change. I've got UHF and VHF mixed up on there, and I think I got one of the frequencies wrong on there. So you want to match what I have here as I talk through it. But before you do that, just listen to me for a second. This is probably the most technical thing we're going to talk about. I just want you to know what's going on when people throw out these numbers. It's going to be on your test, but I'd like for you to just have a basic idea of what the heck this means. UHF, VHF, it's going to get thrown around a lot, okay? There's two things going on with this frequency. It's the frequency and the wavelength. So if you see this little picture I've got, it's on your sheet too. That top wave is high frequency. That wave pattern is going up and down very close together. So if you watch my hand, a wave length is a completion of going from zero up, back past zero and down, and then returning to zero. So that full cycle, the length of that full cycle is the wavelength. How the actual distance that it covers to make that hertz. It's called a hertz. So the measure of that length is the wavelength. UHF is 70 centimeters long. So a meter is 100 centimeters. So it's 0.7 centimeters, or 0.7 meters. I think that's wrong on yours. And then VHF is 2 meters long, so it's much longer, more than double the wavelength. Comparatively, the frequency of UHF is higher, so it's 440 megahertz. So that means 440 million cycles per second. VHF is 144. I'm not sure. I think I put 220 for some reason. But 144 for VHF. You can download the new slide to replace your sheet if you want to. It's all right. So the reason I'm telling you this is when you see an antenna or a radio, they're going to say 70 centimeter / 2 meter. That means dual band. That means UHF, VHF. So if you see 2 meter, 70 centimeter, that's what it's talking about. If you see 440 and 144, that means dual band. You're going to see those numbers all over the place with radio stuff, and that's what it means. It means it's VHF or UHF capable. You're going to look for either those numbers or the words dual band when you buy stuff. So like this antenna is optimized for both bands. It's the right length. This is actually a quarter length of that wavelength. It's why it works well. It's because they've precisely measured the length of this wire, and it's good at catching that frequency, basically. You think about like if you're using a fishing net, it's deciding how big the holes are on the fishing net, right? I'm not trying to get into the physics with you guys. I just want basically you to know when you see those numbers, that's what you're looking for. If you see something like 6 meters, 6 meters is an HF band. You're not licensed to use that. It's a totally different thing. It uses a whole bunch of different equipment we're not talking about today. If you see something different than 70 centimeters or 2 meters, it's kind of out of bounds for what we're talking about. And if you want to get into that, go for it. I'm not even into it. It's very complicated and expensive, and you can do all kinds of cool stuff. You can talk to people in Africa on some of that stuff, but that's not what we're talking about for today. The difference between these is pretty minimal, but in general, VHF, because it has the long wavelength, it can travel longer distances. So in a perfect world, VHF is going to be good for distance, and UHF is going to be better when there's obstacles. So like in a building or if there's trees, if you look at those wave patterns, imagine which one of those is more likely to make it through something with holes in it. You know, if it has more chances because it's a high frequency, it's going to penetrate things better. So generally, UHF is going to be, if you're picking a range to use, I'd pick UHF just because it's going to be the most versatile. There is, and I mentioned this several different places, there is no replacement for actually experimenting and trying things. I can tell you all day that VHF is better for distance, but you might be in a situation where it's not, and UHF works better. And I don't know why. We may never know why, but if it works better, it does. So you're going to need to test this stuff, try it, test the theory, and experiment. You're not going to just be able to rely on the textbook with radio. There's a lot of variables. Okay, one more kind of technical thing. Any questions about the UHF, VHF? Sorry. All right. Analog versus digital modes. This is a new thing. Previously, kind of historically, amateur radio has been analog. So basically, that signal is not, it's not transmitted in bits and bytes. It's an actual signal that's being transmitted and modulated into your speaker. It degrades at distance, so that crackly sound you hear when it's just fading out, you don't get that with digital. That's an analog thing. Digital is pass-fail. It either comes through or it does not come through. There's no crackling and degrading. You think about like your Wi-Fi connection, it works or it doesn't, right? You're connected or you're not connected. There is a degradation in power, but there's no degradation in signal quality. Websites load or they don't. You don't get black spots on a white page if you have a poor signal. It just takes longer. So you've got to probably, for the purpose of this class and anything we're doing, I would just stick to analog. Getting into digital is fun. You'll see some of these repeaters out in the area are going to be digital capable, and they'll be connected to the internet, so you might be able to talk to people all over the world that are also connected to an internet connected repeater. So you think, if I've got a repeater in this room that's connected to the internet and somebody in Africa has one connected to the internet, they can talk to each other, but that's not radio. I can do that with a phone call. I don't need to use my radio. I'm not sure what people are into about that. It's more of a gimmick to me. And the unfortunate thing is there's so many proprietary versions. You have to own, like Yaesu radios, which we'll talk about. I've got one here. They have their own kind of digital. You can only talk to other people with Yaesu radios. So you can't talk from Yaesu to ICOM because ICOM uses D-Star. So you're pretty pigeonholed into your own equipment, and all your people will have to have that same equipment to be able to talk. So my recommendation is to just kind of steer clear of digital for now. If you want to get into that, that's fine, but don't worry too much about it for now. One note, digital can serve as kind of a poor man's encryption. So because you have to have the right radio tuned to the right thing to be able to talk, people are less likely to be able to listen to you if they don't have that stuff. So if you're trying to be under the radar, you know that's really important to you. You might want to invest in that, but that's not what we're here to do today. Any questions about digital? Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
In shopping for a radio, it seemed like D-Star was like the next step up as far as getting a tri-band. Is that a good assumption? Would you say that is probably the most popular digital?
I'll just repeat the question for the recording. So you asked if D-Star seems to be a step up in quality or price, at least for radios. Is that a good one to start with?
That was the next progression.
Right.
So is that working into being the most popular digital?
No, it's not. It essentially, the most popular digital mode is you're going to have to look up what's in your area. So if there aren't repeaters using D-Star that you can hit from your house, it's worthless to you. So it really just depends on the adoption in your area. So you can look up, I've got some information about repeaterbook.com. You can put in your zip code and say, okay, is there anything on D-Star within 30 miles of me? I would definitely check that before you buy one, because you might buy something you can't talk to anything except other D-Star radios, and they need to be within a few miles. So no, I've played a tiny bit with Wires X System Fusion for Yaesu just because I have one. I'm not interested in it. It's just kind of silly to me. You will see the more expensive radios do have digital. It's kind of an expected thing. It's like you expect your car to have power windows. but it doesn't mean you love having power windows. It's just kind of going to come with it now. So, and you had something?
You're using a digital radio and a repeater with a digital.
Yes.
The internet goes down, you're dead in the water, right?
No, the repeater will work. The connectivity to other repeaters, like I was mentioning. So like if I have one and then somebody in Africa has one, they are talking to each other over the internet, but that repeater might still work if the internet goes down. So kind of like your computer, it'll still work. The Wi-Fi might be down, but I can use the computer. It's digital. The main thing is a lot of what people think is so fun about it is that you can talk to people places you could never talk before, but it's dependent on the infrastructure that's there with the internet. So I don't see the upside, especially for what we were talking about, emergency preparedness. It's just a little silly. I'd rather make a FaceTime call or a Google Hangout or, make a phone call.
So if they're interested in being able to reach people at a longer distance, high frequency would be the next step up for them. That
Yeah,
require
HF.
internet and other stuff, right?
Yeah, HF is, I haven't even ventured into there, but as far as trying to reach places far away, you're going to need HF abilities. It's going to require very expensive radios, big antennas that are strung between trees hanging in your yard, and you're going to need a lot more technical expertise. It's not as easy as just plug in a frequency. The time of day matters. The weather matters. It's literally, instead of line of sight, a lot of HF frequencies actually bounce off the atmosphere. So you're able to go around the world, but it may only work at 70 degrees on a summer day to hit, Los Angeles from here. It's not going to be something that's as easy as, with these, if they work, they're generally going to work. The conditions aren't that important unless an obstacle comes on the scene.
So you had CB, FRM, FRS,
Mhm.
MS, VHF, UHF.
Mhm.
Now you're saying just HF. Is HF beyond all that?
It
or
it is. That's why I don't even have it on the list. That's kind of where we're going to end for today.
So it's a frequency that's higher than
It is.
the ultra high and the
Very long wavelengths. So
very long wavelength.
6 meter, 10 meter, I believe, those sorts
Just
of
a
things.
different
It is. And so the wavelength determines the size of the antenna. So you imagine this is a quarter wave antenna, a 2 meter cut in a quarter, versus, I think these are around 19 inches. If you are on the 10 meter band, even a quarter wave is still 2.5 meters. So that's almost 10-foot long antenna you've got to have at minimum. And usually, if you really want to get distance, you might need an actual 10-meter antenna.
You also need a lot more power too, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
To push that long frequency.
Right, you're in the hundreds of watts territory most likely. So that just means bring more money. You can do it, and it's going to be more complicated. I don't even mention it really because it's just more confusion. But yes, when you hear about people that are talking, kind of the stereotypical, in the 80s, the kids are talking to people across the world. That's what they're doing, and it was very nerdy, very geeky, and still is because it's so complicated to even get that to work. And the investment in just the equipment is exponentially more than your $20 Baofeng radio. I mean, you're talking $2,000 for the radio, and then another several thousand in peripherals. Okay. All right, let's talk about repeaters. Repeaters are super important, and I think probably one of the most fun and helpful parts of the technician's capability. It's worth mentioning all that HF stuff we just said. You need a different license also. You need your general license or your expert license, which is a different test. So you're not even licensed to use that until you get that extra qualification. But repeaters are going to be accessible to you, and this is how you're going to extend your range functionally. So when you're at the limits of your equipment, when you're antenna is as high as you can get it and you're using the most power you've got, that's it. Without a repeater, there's no way to make that go further. So what a repeater does, if you see that little diagram, you see those two vehicles on either side of a mountain. That repeater on top is what they're each talking to. So they don't have to reach one another, they just have to reach that repeater. So if you imagine a Wi-Fi network, we've talked about that already so many times, everything on that network can talk to each other. It may not be able to reach, like my laptop maybe can't actually reach another laptop in this building, but because we can all connect to the Wi-Fi, I can send files to that, right? So think of it as the router of the Wi-Fi network for radio. It can extend your range around here at least 30 miles. So what it basically does is with my little handheld antenna, my handheld radio with a short antenna, if I can hit that repeater, it turns this into an ultra powerful blaster. I'm going to have hundreds of watts of power with an antenna mounted 1,500 feet in the sky because I'm benefiting from that repeater. My radio basically is using that repeater to blast out, okay? So anybody that can get to that repeater can also get to me. And if you're thinking about trying to reach people, like we were talking about, even somebody only a few miles away, if you don't have perfect conditions, it may just not be possible to get a signal from you to somebody. You need a repeater. That's going to extend your range. If it can reach 30 miles, that's a radius. So that's actually 60 miles. If you're on this end of it and the other person happens to be directly across the diameter of that radius, that circle, that's 60 miles. So, if that repeater happens to be perfectly between you, you can get very far. So if you had a lot of money to solve a problem, you could put a repeater every 30 miles, lease a little piece of property, hook one up, put a tower up, and you could go infinitely. You could put them across the whole world if you had the money to do it. There's better ways to do that, obviously. That's why we have the internet and we have wireless technology. Go ahead.
What was the website on the repeater lookup?
Repeaterbook.com. Oh, it's on my slide here. I added it. So repeaterbook.com and radioreference.com are two places that you can put in your address and see what's around you. So something to make note of. A lot of these repeaters do have emergency backup power. Who knows how long that is? You can't depend on these for a grid down situation. The apocalypse comes. You're not going to be using other people's repeaters. Maybe yours if you invested in a $10,000 solar array to run the thing, but you're not going to be able to depend on them. So the one that I really use a lot is W4CQ. I have a slide on it here next. It's in Gastonia, but it's on Anderson Mountain, and it's I'm sorry, not Anderson Mountain. No, it's. I can't think of the name of it, but it's in the Gastonia area, Spencer Mountain, and it's on a broadcast TV antenna tower that has one of those blinking lights on it for the airplanes, and those blinking lights have to have emergency power, right? So there's a diesel generator hooked to that light system, and so they have permission to have tied their repeater to that power line. So that thing, as soon as the power goes out, it flips over to diesel. It's still going to work. So in a hurricane or in a power outage that's not significant for, it's not a 6-month power outage, maybe it's 6 days, that is still going to work. So that one, I know that one. I make sure I know how to get to that one, and it's going to work for me, right? Because we don't want airplanes hitting antenna masts even when the power's out. So they make sure that light blinks. Most repeaters are not going to have that kind of benefit. That is a diamond in the rough, once in a lifetime situation to have a really high hill in the Piedmont of North Carolina with a 1,500-foot antenna on it with emergency power. That's like all the stars have aligned. This is a beautiful miracle. But I'm happy to benefit from it. I can hit it from my house. All my family members can hit it. That's the one we're using. All right, so it's important to know that kind of stuff.
Now, can you reach that from here then?
Probably so, yep. Yep.
And then also, like, for the, like, kind of general distance on these, so like, if one does go out and, you know, there's not one available like that, how far can you reach? Like,
We'll talk more about that. The radios themselves have very limited distance. You're going to need a very high mounted antenna to get anything past what you would expect a Walmart walkie-talkie to do, to be honest with you. Just for the sake of clarity on that. I mean, there are exceptions. I've been on top of Mount Mitchell with my handheld, and I can talk radio to radio for 20 miles on Mount Mitchell, but am I likely to be in an emergency situation where I'm at the highest point in North Carolina and everyone else is down low? No, it's just not. So, we talked about this earlier when I talked about licensing, but these repeaters are a social network for a lot of people. So that W4CQ repeater I mentioned, they call that the Oscar repeater because there's a 90-some-year-old man who lives in a nursing home in Gastonia now that's basically the grandpa of that repeater. He's on it all day, every day. He was my first contact. So when I got my license, I just happened to go on that repeater, put out my call sign, testing, and he responded. And so he knows everybody. He's kind of like the mascot of that repeater. And there's a little community of people that are always on. They got a radio in their car. They do it at night. They check in on the net. So they'll have basically a talk group once a week where people check in and report the weather or report what the temperature is or something silly like that. But you can get a lot of help from people on these repeaters. So literally I've called in, hey, I'm trying to get this to work between me and my neighbor. We're having trouble. Anybody got a minute? You know, everybody on there is going to be competent with radios, right? It's kind of like you filter it down. It's like a chat room for just ham radio people. So it's not like I'm sending out a radio broadcast on car radios asking for help. I'm asking to a select group of people, hey, can I get quick advice from somebody? Having access to that is super good. Like that's hugely beneficial because those guys do it all day, every day. Most of them are retirement age. They've been doing it since they were a kid. So they've got decades of experience. Repeaters are going to be named by their transmit frequency. So you'll see a number. We're going to look at one of them here in a minute. And then, as I said, you can look them all up on repeaterbook.com. That's my favorite. A side note, you can have your own repeaters inside of a radio. So this radio, I just bought it recently. It's used, it's called it looks like Watson, but I think you actually say Ocean is how you pronounce that. But this radio will do what's called cross-band repeating. So we talked about dual-band radios. This will receive something on 70 centimeter and put it back out on 2 meter. So what that means is if I tune it to 144, if I put this on top of a mountain and connect it to a battery, turn it on, and leave it there, I can go back to my house on this side of the mountain, transmit on one frequency, and my buddy can be on a different frequency and he can hear me. So it basically receives and transmits back out as if I was on top of that mountain, right? This is like $100, $150 compared to a real repeater. It's not crossband. Everybody's on the same frequency. And it's going to cost you thousands of dollars. You're going to need a big antenna mast. So if you happen to have a situation temporarily or even permanent where you can't get to somebody else and you want to have independent communication that you own, you could go set something like that up with a little solar panel and have this thing crossband repeating. That That's not going to be as reliable, right? You're going to have weather issues, but it's doable. Go ahead.
With the crossband, do you have to have a second radio to pick up if your person across the mountain wants to transmit back to you?
No, it's bidirectional. You can set it up to be bidirectional. So as long as someone is sending on one of those frequencies, it'll always blast it on the other one, though. That's the thing. So the two people have to be on different frequencies, and that can get complicated, right? So you would just have an agreement with the person. If they need to get in touch with you, they're always on this one and you're always on that one, and that's how you configure it. Because if you're on the same frequency, you can't get to each other. The mountain's in the way. So the cross band allows it to go over the mountain, basically. It's a cheap way, but you can do it technically with two bow things and a cable between them. There's ways to do that. That would be a terrible choice, and we'll talk about why these radios suck. But you can do it, and basically the microphone gets tied to the speaker, right? If you've ever heard feedback on a sound system, you know, if a speaker is repeating what the microphone does, it makes that loud, annoying, ear-piercing sound. You're basically forcing that over the wire, telling this radio, when you get a signal, push it back out on this other frequency. So crossband repeaters, if you want like an off-grid, independent, poor man's version of a repeater, you can do it. And I'm happy. That's a rabbit hole you should go down after today if you think that's important to you. I'm not going to go into it in much further detail because it's just, for the people here that are brand new, that's like, what in the world? I can't even figure out how to use my own radio now. You're adding more complications. So any more question about repeaters though? All right. So here's an example of one. That screenshot on the right-hand side of this next slide is from repeaterbook.com, and this is the repeater that I mentioned earlier. I'm gonna talk you through this stuff so you have some idea what you're looking at, and you might want to take notes of how this makes sense to you. I've put notes on here, but I'm going to talk you through kind of what all that stuff on the right side means. So we already talked about that frequency is really kind of the channel, right? That's interchangeable terminology. The downlink and the uplink, that's the receive and transmit, right? So those are frequencies. 444.45, that is the frequency the repeater is known by. So if you're like, hey, go to the 444.45 repeater, it's kind of going to be known by that frequency. The downlink is what's called on this. And the uplink is 449.45. I'm very sorry, but I think on the previous slide I have a typo. They're referred to by their receive frequency, not transmit. So I have it correct on this one. But let's look at these. So you see those two frequencies at the top right? The thing underneath that, the plus 5 megahertz. Anybody have an idea what that might mean? Look at the difference between the downlink and the uplink. One's 444 and one's 449. So the difference between them is positive 5 megahertz. So the offset, the reason it has that there is basically that's the difference between receive and transmit. Now, something that you'll see with higher end radios is if you put in that downlink number, it automatically knows what the uplink number is based on the frequency. So there's kind of a standard that they usually follow. Anything in a certain bracket will have this much offset, and then this bracket will have this much offset. On a Baofeng, you have to know all these numbers. On a higher end radio, you can probably program this radio with just the downlink and the tone, and it'll do the rest automatically for you. So moving on down to the tone, what this is for is to tell the repeater that you want to use it. So when it receives your frequency, or when it receives your signal, your transmission from your radio, it's accompanied by a tone that's 82.5 megahertz. Has anyone ever taken a hearing test and you hear that starts real low and it goes and you kind of wait till you can't hear it anymore? Eventually they become inaudible, right? I think about 60 hertz is considered what's audible for humans. I can't remember off the top of my head. But basically, when your radio is sending that tone, it knows to turn on. So it's kind of like you could say a flag that's attached to your signal that says this is intended for a repeater. So the reason being, you might be using that frequency to just talk to other radios, and you might not be trying to use the repeater. You might not even know the repeater exists, and you don't want to be turning it on and sending your traffic over the repeater and disturbing other people's discussions. So this tone, if you don't have that plugged in, you won't be able to use the repeater. And there's a list of, I think, about a dozen different tones that it can be configured to use. It's going to be different for every repeater, but you're going to definitely need to know that tone and program it into your radio for you to be able to use the repeater. Some other common settings that aren't repeater related down here on the left: squelch. You'll see that a lot. This basically, when you turn a radio on, you don't just hear static. It mutes itself, and it only turns on when it detects a transmission, right? So it'll light up and start playing when somebody's talking, but when it's on, you don't hear static. Squelch is basically the level of sensitivity you set from the static. So if you want to set that to where you only want to hear people if they are right in your front yard, then you might set it very high. If you want to hear everything that could possibly be a transmission, you'd set your squelch as low as you can. Higher end radios are going to be more sensitive. A Baofeng, you're going to set it to its minimum, and you're going to be lucky if it works, because it's not going to have the sensitivity. That's an expensive thing to do, to get your radio to know the difference between a weak signal and static. That's just, the difference is very expensive to detect. So a higher end radio is going to have better filtering, basically. And then scan. Scanning is really important, because basically if you're traveling or you're trying to listen, say you have put all your local repeaters in your radio, you can set it to scan and just set it down, and it will stop, kind of like scan on your car radio. It'll stop when it finds a channel that's active, and it'll let you listen for a couple seconds, and it'll keep going. So it's a way you can monitor 50 repeaters, and you might scan through them at 2 or 3 per second, and you can just leave your radio on scan all the time. If you're listening out for news, let's say you're out hiking and you just want to be able to get to somebody, but you don't know if anybody's even out there, you could put it on scan and just keep hiking until you hear something, and then jump on that repeater. So scanning is another big difference between the cheap radios and the high-end ones. My Yaesu scans like lightning fast. Like, I can't even read the name of the station. It just scans super fast, versus a Baofeng, it's like scan, scan, scan. It's like a little nice hopscotch pace. And it works, but if you're in a bad situation, you want to scan as many things as fast as possible, your cheap radio is going to do a bad job at it. You get what you pay for. So we'll talk more about that. Any questions about the common settings and all this? We'll do the actual programming of a repeater later, but I wanted you to kind of know what these things mean.
You're using scan,
Mhm.
say you're in a very remote area,
Mhm.
and there are no repeaters. Is it scanning just frequency?
It's scanning whatever you've got plugged in. So, I mean, you can set it to scan also all frequencies. You can. So, kind of, if you put it on channel mode, it's going to scan what you have programmed into it. If you put it on frequency mode, it'll literally scan every frequency. It'll take it 10 minutes to make it through the frequency range, though, so the chance of you catching something is just really low. But if you sat there for 8 hours, you know, if you're shipwrecked, probably put it on frequency and let it scan because you don't have a clue what to put in. But yeah, scanning, one of the more fun things to do for me was to, when I first started, is program everything I can think of into it and just scan and listen and see what happens, because you don't know where activity is. Some of these repeaters, nothing is going on. They're up and running, but nobody ever talks on them. And then some of them, people are talking all day long. So it's pretty good feature to use. All right, this one is an intimidating piece of it. It was for me, at least. It's kind of your etiquette and your lingo. My advice, if once you get licensed, even before you get licensed, is spend a lot of time listening on these repeaters. Don't try to talk a whole lot when you first start. Just listen and kind of observe how people talk, what lingo they use. You may not know what they're saying. They may use codes. Look them up and see what they mean and kind of decipher it and get a feel for the way people talk before you try to jump in and fall all over yourself, right? You're always going to start your transmission with your call sign. So I've got 2 commonly used ones there. You know, hold down the button, KN4WRX monitoring. Let off the button. All that means is, hey, I'm here. Right, I'm listening. If somebody's interested in talking, they might give their call sign and say hello, and they might start talking. Or nobody might respond. But that's kind of if you want to do your first thing, the second one, you give your call sign and say testing. Do it twice. That's going to initiate people to respond to you. Hey, you're coming through loud and clear, or hey, I can barely catch you. What was that call sign? Here you see, if you're using a repeater, you are expected to start with your call sign. If you don't have one, people are either going to ignore you or get on your case or ask you what it is. People are generally around here very nice if you don't know the lingo. I've had no problem, but I've heard kind of horror stories from newbies that they just get beat up real bad in their area. Maybe that's, you know, in more metropolitan areas. If they don't use the right lingo, people don't. It's like you're not in the club. You're not cool enough. You don't know how to talk right. So get out of here. I've not had that problem though. But I do recommend kind of listening in and following the etiquette. Don't let yourself be intimidated. At the end of the day, who cares what these people on the other end think, right? You're there to learn. You're there to use it. It's as much yours as it is theirs to use. So the point is just be prepared to kind of use what's proper just to save yourself the headache. Using CB lingo like Breaker 19 or using a nickname and stuff like that, that's kind of frowned upon. They don't want to see that crossover. Ham radio is supposed to be kind of its separate culture from CB culture. That's what I've been told. Keeping a phonetic alphabet chart on hand. I have one printed out on my corkboard in my office. That's the best way to actually, you know, because signal might be degrading, to get a letter across to somebody is to use, you know, for me it's Kilo November 4 Whiskey Romeo X-ray. That's how I give my call sign. So if, you know, the difference between the letter might not be obvious without using the full letter. You guys probably heard these in military type stuff. It's a NATO approved thing. And if you don't know the letter, you can use a word that you make up. The problem is these words are specifically distinct from each other. If I say, what's an example, like Mary, like M for Mary, I might be saying Harry, I might be saying Gary. These words are distinct enough where it's obvious. Delta is D. It doesn't sound like anything else that starts with a D really. It's just obviously for D. So keep one of those handy. There's a URL there for a ham speak page on QRZ.com. There's a lot of things people say. There are abbreviations. It's a big reference. An example is like people say 73s. That means goodbye and be well. You might hear that and you're like, what does that mean? Is that new type of record diameter? Is that a new baseball team? I don't know what that means, but if you want to, you can usually Google anything you've heard, ham radio and the word, and it'll tell you what the heck they're saying. I don't recommend like getting fully indoctrinated in that culture. Like you need to start talking like that, but it's good if you're trying to understand what people are saying, it's helpful. All right, so this next one, I'm sorry, any questions about that? Go ahead.
Call signs, but what's to prevent you from just making them up? Like, is there any?
Yep, they're all publicly available, and most of those guys, QRZ.com is a popular place that you can create like a profile page for yourself for your call sign. But all of the call signs are public, and most of those guys, if they've never heard your call sign, they're going to write it down and look it up just to see who you are. Kind of put a name with a name or a face with a name if you have a profile picture. So that's where people get nervous about the privacy thing is anything you say, it can be traced to you because you had to identify yourself. So that's intentional. They don't want you using this for illicit activity or private activity. Everything you say can be heard by anybody else that's on that channel. So, keep that in mind. But yeah, they will look you up, and they also are going to learn your name. If you use that repeater, they'll identify you by your call sign. It's uncanny to me. People know the call signs better than they do the real names of people. But it's just kind of something they're used to doing. They do mean things. I believe the 4 in mine, the KN4 is like a region number. The last 3 are, they're kind of like the first 2 letters. It's either 1 or 2 first letters in all the call signs. That's kind of where they are on the list for that region right now. So at the time, they had to add a second letter, kind of like license plates started to get longer over the years. So the KN is kind of, here's where we are in line of how many registrations we've had over the years. The 4 is the region, and then the WRX part of mine, I cannot remember what they refer to that as. But a lot of times on a net, the reason I'm trying to think of that is they'll say, okay, we'll just call it like the sublet of your frequency. I can't remember the term, but sublets A through N check in, and then sublets M through Z check in, and I would wait for that second half because of the W in my WRX. So if you ever hear that, that's what they're referring to as the last letters in your call sign. They're trying to divide the traffic. Like if you go to a potluck and they say everybody's last name starts with A to G, bring a dessert, and then the other people bring a side. So you don't end up with too many, right? So that's kind of what that means. I cannot think of what the WRX part of that call sign is referred to, I'm sorry, but it's basically those last letters. All right, some resources that are going to be important for you guys going forward. Your local club, that's where you're going to take tests, that's where you're going to meet people. They usually do projects together. They'll build antennas, they'll track satellites and try to do fun stuff occasionally. The culture is coming back for that kind of stuff for a while. It's my understanding it kind of died out because all the people that were interested in this have gotten old and they just don't have an interest in doing stuff a lot. But now, because of YouTube, I think there's a resurgence, and of course preparedness-minded people, there's a resurgence in interest, and the clubs are really growing. So Elmers are what you refer to basically your mentor as. So like in the old days, I guess, a young interested kid would kind of be taken under the wing of a veteran, and they would refer to him as an Elmer. So my Elmer kind of got me ready for my test. He taught me everything he knows, and that was kind of how things were handed down. You might be able to find one. I don't know. I've never found one. My Elmer is the internet. Other hams are obviously a good resource. Other we refer to other ham radio users as hams. In my opinion, the best online resource is the ham radio crash course guy, Josh. I can't remember his last name. He has a great YouTube channel. His videos are pretty long. They're not short and to the point. They're usually a live stream where he's cutting up and having fun. So he might have an hour-and-a-half video about how to program your Baofeng, and it's only 10 minutes of content. But he's the most relatable and consistently quality content I've found on the subject. What I like almost as much as his YouTube channel is his Facebook group. It's basically a forum that you can go ask questions, search it for. If someone's already asked a question, you can usually find what you're looking for. People make suggestions, help you troubleshoot. Really good group of people on that Facebook group. I think you can request. It's not public, but it's easy to get into it. Just don't be a jerk, basically. Other two good YouTube channels I've listed there, Ham Radio 2.0 and Ham Radio Concepts. I mean, that's just stuff for me. YouTube is where I've learned a lot of stuff that might be not your thing. I think these are the best, especially because they can show you things instead of just reading about it, which you'll see today why that's so helpful. The operation of some of these radios can be a bit intimidating. QRZ.com is basically the yellow pages, the white pages of ham radio. You're going to be able to look up call signs. There's a classified section on there. You'll hear it called QRZ. And then repeaterbook.com, that's my favorite for looking up repeaters. And then AARL is kind of the granddaddy of all the licensing and clubs, and it's kind of just a big database of information. They put out the testing manuals and study guides and stuff like that. So places to buy stuff, I would be very careful with eBay just because of counterfeit stuff, especially with cheap things. Used stuff, you should be fine, but if you're trying to buy new Baofeng radios, just don't buy them on eBay. There's better, more reliable places. Amazon, be careful there also. If it's Prime, at least you can return it easily. They do have higher prices on pretty much everything radio related for some reason, so you'll pay a premium to buy from Amazon. Like this Anytone radio is $400 most places, and it's $450 on Amazon. I don't know why. For kind of the Chinese stuff, the cheaper, Baofeng, TYT, some of the stuff you guys brought, the two places I prefer to buy from are on here, Radioddity and buy2radios.com. I will mention there's a place called Baofeng Tech. So it's the word Baofeng and then Tech. They sell under the name B-Tech on Amazon also. That's kind of the U.S. importer of all the stuff. So you can also buy from them, or if you see B-Tech on it on Amazon, it's probably pretty decent. What you want to avoid is just counterfeit. Like, this is already a cheap radio. A counterfeit of a cheap radio is a piece of junk. I mean, like, it won't even work. The mic hole won't be drilled in the right place, and you won't be able to talk. It's a 1/16 of an inch hole. It's not like it's that complicated. All right, so for the good stuff, these three top ones are kind of the three heavy hitters in the ham radio world. Gigaparts, HRO, Ham Radio Outlet, and DX Engineering. Those are in order of my preference. That's where I would buy your radio. You can buy extended warranties through them. They will help you. You can call them. They're smart, capable, kind people. Compared to if you buy on Amazon, they'll happily take your return, but they're not going to help you. You could literally call them up, tell them what you're trying to do, and they'll help you find what you want. The Wireman is, I've bought from them at a ham fest, which is basically like a swap meet for ham radio stuff in the local area, but they have a website. That's where I recommend, if you've got to buy a big long antenna cable, buy it from them. They're good people. You can call them, tell them what you need. They will make your wire. It's made in the U.S., very high quality. The connectors are going to be solid. They don't cut corners. We'll talk about wires more, but that's where I recommend buying your wire from if it has to be custom made. Signalstuff.com is where I recommend buying antennas. We're going to have a whole deal on that. N9TAX Labs is where I buy the roll-up antennas. And then your local Hamfest, if we ever have them again, when we're allowed to be places in person, are a good resource to buy used stuff. And some of these are smaller retailers will come and they'll run specials. You can pay for a radio with cash. That's where I got my Yaesu. I got for like $20 cheaper than you can get it anywhere online by buying it in person. So just keep this list. I'm not, you're not stuck on this, but this is what I would stick to buy stuff. So for example, that slide, I hope to have saved you hours of heartache by just giving you this list. You could find all that on your own by ordering from somewhere and getting scammed and losing money. Like, this is just a shortcut I'm trying to give you. So feel free to deviate at your own risk. All right. So handheld radios, just as a category, okay? They're going to also be called HTs. That's what they used to call these back in the day. It means handy-talkie. I don't know why. It's very childish sounding. But if you see somebody refer to them as an HT or hear the word HT on the air, they're talking about a handheld radio. The good things, it's small and lightweight. It's pretty cheap, pretty versatile, pretty capable for what it is, right? This is a very powerful thing. Now, I did mention, obviously, like our cell phone can do a lot more in about the same size, but as far as radios goes, it's a very capable thing in a small package. It used to take a big old tube-filled desktop-mounted device to do what this can do a lot less capably. Some of the downsides on these, they're low power, so most handhelds are going to be 5 watts or less. That's just your transmit power. The more watts, the more powerful, okay? 5 watts doesn't sound like a lot because it's not a lot. They have a pretty limited user interface because it's small, right? So not room for a lot of buttons and screens on these. They do have some pretty high-end radios now, I mean, for $300 and $400 that are just a big touch screen, and they have a much better interface, but you'll pay for it. And they have pretty limited capacity and functionality. So, you know, I mentioned your Baofeng has 128 channels. One of these big radios, a mobile radio, might have 1,000 channels. And I might be able to set up, all right, here's my group at home. Here's my group when I'm in Tennessee. Here's my group between home and Tennessee with all of them, so I can be scanning select groups at a time and stuff like that. You're not going to have as much functionality in a handheld unit. It's just, you can't fit it in there. Some common applications for these little guys, obviously, all the stuff we talked about, you can use this, you know, those 4 categories we talked about at the beginning. It can be used for all of them, but it's not great to have one of these as your base station because of the limited power. You're not going to be able to reach as far out and benefit from that high man antenna if you don't have power to get the signal out from that antenna. Plus, you're going to lose power over the line. So, these are typically what you're going to have on a plate carrier. So if you're into that kind of thing, my current setup that I just ran through a rifle class is a Baofeng with a extended battery with a little remote mic up here by my shoulder. This is kind of the minimum necessary setup. It can get much fancier, much better. I did not like this setup in my class. I kept accidentally bumping this knob on at the end of every drill.
Channel mode.
My radio would be on at the end of every drill. They make little 3D printed covers for those knobs. In my opinion, you want to be able to get to your radio. Some people put their radios places all over, I assume, because they don't expect to be changing channels. But for the use I use a radio for, it's generally scanning and trying to make communication. So it just depends on the situation. But you're going to want one for a plate carrier if you're into that. All right, so how do you decide what to buy with a handheld radio? This is kind of the question. People usually start here, right? So half of you guys already bought radios. You don't know anything about them, but you already bought one. And we've spent, 2 hours on stuff before that. That's normal. But I like to catch people before they buy them because it can save you some pain and suffering. So let's talk about that. With radios, like most stuff, you're going to get what you pay for. There's no way to make a $20 radio do what a $150 radio can do. It just, there are sacrifices being made. We're going to talk about the place that a cheap radio has. I do think it has a place, but I don't think it has a place as your primary radio. So you're going to get durability. I can drop this Yaesu and it's probably going to survive. I can buy a Yaesu that's shockproof and waterproof. I can't do that with a Baofeng. It's going to feel better. The buttons won't, get stuck under the case, and the switches have a nice feel to them. Everything's quality compared to the lowest bidder went to a Baofeng, most likely. They're going to be far, far easier to use. The investment in the user interface is exponentially more on a quality radio. I can program a repeater into this radio literally 10 times faster than on a Baofeng, just because of the way they've designed it to work. And as I mentioned, like that repeater offset, that plus 5 megahertz that I needed to know for that repeater we looked at, it's going to automatically know that. It's just built into this radio. If you plug in 444.45, it knows that range is a plus 5 offset. It's just going to put it in and skip past it. Whereas on a Baofeng, I'm going to have to plug each digit of that in, and it's lots of fun. Your audio quality, your scanning, we talked about all that with squelch. Everything about a quality, expensive radio is going to be better. If you're having trouble communicating with somebody that's far away and you're using cheap radios, just simply swapping those out for better radios might solve the whole problem. It might not, but I would rather start with eliminating that as the failure point if it was me. So keep that in mind. And warranty and support. I mean, there's no warranty or support for a Baofeng. You're lucky if you got a manual with it. If you buy from Radioddity, they do send a manual, which is why I recommend them. They basically just weed out the crap, and so you get that, so you know how bad it's going to be, and then they'll send you a programming cable as well. The most important thing I think to start with is to think, what's your purpose? So why am I getting this radio? If this is truly something that is emergency preparedness, it's something that you're going to need on your worst day, that is not an economical choice for most things, right? You're not going to, the car you drive every day for, you don't want an ambulance to be built on a junkyard frame, right? Like your ambulance, you want that sucker to be well maintained. You want it to work when it's time to get your butt to the hospital to get sewed up. Same thing with your radio. I would budget the money to get a decent radio. It'll last you probably your whole life. This does not change. The technology is not going to radically change. It'll at least last you 10 years. So $150 radio, 10 years, $15 a year, $1.25 a month or something. You can afford it. So that's what I would recommend. So another thing to think about, I always laugh. I used to be really heavily into motorcycles, and people would buy motorcycles and have no money left over for a helmet, a jacket, gloves, boots. You got to have all that stuff to ride a motorcycle. Radios are no different. When you buy a radio, the first thing you do, and this one has the stock antenna on it, the first thing I like to do is take this, you turn lefty-loosey, and then you take this and you hold it over a trash can. And that's the first upgrade, is to get rid of that stock antenna because they're terrible. And then you put a $20 antenna on it. But now you have a $20 antenna on a $20 radio, so now it's $40. And then you need a programming cable. Well, that's $20 more. And you need a microphone, that's $20 more. And before you know it, you got $150 in a $20 radio, and none of that stuff works with a good radio. It only works with this one. None of that works with my Yaesu. So I would be careful about investing further in this. Put a good antenna on it. We'll talk about the antennas and kind of leave it at that. I wouldn't buy a bunch of crap for your Baofeng. If you're going to buy car chargers and extra batteries and a microphone, unless you need a rig that you know you want to go beat it up in training classes, that's why I have the Baofeng set up, is because I know if I break all that stuff, at least I didn't break $500 worth of stuff. I would stick to a better radio otherwise. So the lower cost, lower quality, my recommendation is the Baofeng UV5R, because it's the ubiquitous, widely known, everyone knows what it is. They're all basically the same. The programming is the same. All the parts are interchangeable. The batteries work with other models. The antennas are all the same. They all use the Kenwood connector for the programming cable and the microphone. They're basically the Kleenex of the cheap radio market. So that's where I would start if you haven't got one. If you already have something, that's fine. Chances are it's pretty much the same thing. On higher cost, higher quality radios, there's kind of the three big Japanese manufacturers, Yaesu, ICOM, and Kenwood. You can't go wrong with any of them. And then Anytone is a fairly new one. I've got an Anytone. They're kind of mid-level. I like them a lot. I don't know that they're quite the same quality, but they sure are close. And then last up here, consider the compatibility as you invest in stuff. So just like if you're into pistols and you are going to shoot Glocks, all your holsters can be Glock, all your mags can be Glock, your sights, everything that all your maintenance stuff. If you keep with that family of products, then everything you have will always work with it. So like at my house, I recently changed to a Glock 45, which is basically a Glock 17 with a Glock 19 slide. I got rid of all my Glock 19 stuff. So in my house, if I see a pistol mag, it works in my gun. All right, so I can load it. I don't have to wonder, is this a 19 or a 17 mag? I got to read my writing on it or check the back. I can jam it in the gun and go. And so for me, compatibility, that's super important for me, because I know under stress, even if I'm trying to load up for this class, right, and I'm trying to bring all my stuff, I've got a mess of stuff here, right, and some of it works with different radios, and I may have brought the wrong thing. So compatibility is key. I would buy if you're buying stuff for your family members, buy all the same stuff, so that when you buy an accessory, it can work with all those radios. Don't buy 5 different radios for 5 different people unless you love spending money. You had a question?
Did you say that the Kenwood had the same chargers as the Baofeng?
This connector for the speaker and the microphone on the side, the 2-prong, that's called a Kenwood connector. That's pretty common. It's usually either that or kind of like your headphone plug. That's the Yaesu style 3.5 millimeter. But that's what I was referring to, is that's for some reason called a Kenwood mic adapter. Yep.
So there's no compatibility with Baofeng and Kenwood, just that.
Well, you can get adapters that will, you're talking about between Kenwood and Baofeng.
If you already have these and you wanted to go to a higher level model, Kenwood is not the same.
It is, yep. Like if you bought a Kenwood HT, your mic would work with it probably. And I can get an adapter that adapts the plug on a Yaesu to work with my Baofeng mic also. But that's another thing to lose, another thing to come unplugged. So my point just being, kind of decide, it's easier to decide before you invest a lot of money, have a plan, and pick what you're going to buy and have the big picture in mind, right? So if you need to outfit a bunch of people, kind of budget it out, figure out everything you need, and get all the right stuff instead of having to do it twice. We see it all the time with my buddies with AR-15s. They all go buy a $600 AR-15, and then they try to bolt $1,000 worth of stuff to it, and then it breaks in a class. And then they go and end up buying the $1,000 AR-15 they probably should have just waited one more month to buy ahead of time, and they would have been fine from the bottom. But I don't usually catch them until they're already in pain, right? So trying to save you guys the pain. You might need to learn the hard way, and that's fine if you want to do that. I get it.
So let me see if I understand what you said. So
Uh-huh.
if you're gonna ultimately have a base station maybe, or a higher end unit than a
Uh-huh.
handheld, you're saying make sure that you're buying something that's gonna work with the repeaters in your area.
Yep, that too.
So that's one of the first things you start at, right?
If you
Will
want to
that
do
help you
digital,
determine the family?
if not really I'm talking only about handhelds right now, but yeah, if you care about digital and that's interesting to you, you want to look up your repeaters, see what you have the most of, and start. Like if you only have Wires X,
Right.
you're going to want all Yaesu stuff. If you only have DMR, you might want something else.
So to back down, if you think you might go down that road, you wanna
Yep.
back your handhelds.
Definitely, because you'd like to be able to rely on what you've learned and become familiar with all of it. Unless you just want a variety of stuff. You know, some people, this is their thing, and they want one of everything, and that's fine. But I would imagine for most of us, this is a very secondary part of life. This is not going to be your primary hobby. This is just a necessary thing to fill a need. So I'm kind of basing this off of that starting point. But we'll talk about mobiles separately. That's a whole different can of worms. Any questions about kind of what to do when you're going to buy? I'm going to give you some specific recommendations, but this is kind of the theory behind buying stuff, okay? So we're going to go through a couple categories of suggestions. If your purpose, remember we're keeping purpose paramount. That's what's important to think before you start buying is what am I doing? If you're just going to equip your whole neighborhood or everybody you know, you want to get as many radios in as many hands as possible, this is what I think you should do. Buy multi-packs of these from Radioddity. You can get 5 of them for $125, and it'll come with a programming cable. They'll all have manuals. They'll all have base stations to charge them in. Rock and roll. Buy extra batteries, 12-volt adapter, whatever accessories you think you need. If you're trying to do it cheap, you pretty much just get the radio and an antenna. And then I recommend for every radio to upgrade the antenna. The stock antenna is junk. It's unless you're talking within the building, if you're trying to reach any kind of distance, you need to spend $20 on this specific antenna is my recommendation. It's on a separate page. In addition to the accessories, you need to if you're giving this to someone, you need to give them a cheat sheet on how to use it. I recommend something real small or even a folded up 8.5 by 11 printout that says, here's how to turn it on, here's what to do when you turn it on. I mean, if I'm giving this to grandma, it's going to be pre-programmed, and all she's got to do is turn it on, press 001, and start talking, right? Like I can't expect her to remember that, and I certainly can't expect her to know how to do anything more than that without some kind of cheat sheet. So I would highly recommend you have a personalized sort of notepad that you hand out with the radio. So if you're giving this out to people, they have that to empower them to not just have a paperweight. This is not helpful if you don't know how to use it. I've mentioned on here some adapters and stuff. I'm going to talk about that in more detail later, but this is kind of your purchase list. I'll tell you the theory behind some of these. The 12-volt adapter runs this constantly on 12-volt power, so a car battery. These radios are not designed to be charged while they're in use. It's one of the downsides of a Baofeng is you're not supposed to have it on and charging or you'll blow the battery up. A 12-volt adapter will literally replace the battery and you can leave it on all the time. So I could hook it up to this huge battery and have this sitting on my desk at home on all the time. The higher end radio, this can be used and charged at the same time on an AC adapter. So another benefit to a better radio. The AA battery adapters are cool if you're thinking like a prepper mentality. I might be in a grid down situation and I have a ammo can full of AA's, but I can't charge this. You know, you can run it off AA's. I think an adapter for that's like $20. Everything's about $20 with a Baofeng. A USB charging adapter is cool for any radio. I think you should have one because of these power banks you can buy now. You can charge it off of that instead of having to buy a bunch of spare batteries. You buy one big battery that can charge all your crap and make sure you have the adapter for it to work on your radio. And then the SMA to BNC, we're going to talk about that later, but you'll need that. All right, so that's what the multi-pack looks like. That's exactly what I did with these. I bought 2 multi-packs earlier this year and gave one out to all my family just to have with the cheat sheets. All right, so a personal EDC kind of radio. This is a thing that's going to hang out with you in your bag everywhere you go. Buy the most expensive Japanese one you can. All right, so Yaesu, ICOM, Kenwood, maybe in any tone. If you can, I'd say your base price is probably about $150. You can also spend as much as you want. You're going to need a BNC adapter and the antenna. I would go ahead and get some extra batteries, get a 12-volt adapter, get the USB adapter and a cheat sheet, kind of all that stuff. But the difference being the purpose here, this is for you, right? You're not trying to equip the masses. This is going to be your radio for 10, 15, 20 years. Spend the money, get all the good stuff. You could probably for around $250 get a quality radio and all the stuff you need for it. You're going to be close to that even with a Baofeng. You're going to be spending that same amount of money. So, your go time radio on a plate carrier. If you want that sort of situation for you, you know that you need that. That might not be everybody in here, but if you're planning on working in teams with armor on, or you're trying to do patrols or whatever that might be, you're going to want a waterproof, shockproof radio. That's the difference. I don't think I have that on here for some reason. But still the best one you can find. With all the same stuff, you're going to need adapters to make it work with your hearing protection if you care about that. You're going to need that if you're trying to be discreet. You don't want it playing loud right here next to you if you're on a secret patrol mission. I'm not going to go into all the crap you're going to need. You can go down that rabbit hole, but it can be done. You can have a mic on your helmet with all the hearing protection and talk to each other, and it's wonderful. Make sure you train with it. Like I mentioned on my setup, I found out that I'm hitting that button right here all the time. I wouldn't have known that. I put it there intentionally thinking this is convenient. I had to take a class to learn that was a bad idea. And it would suck to have learned that when my life depended on it, right? If I bumped that radio on and I'm trying to clear a house and I just turn my radio on and it announces me to somebody that didn't know I was there, that's not the time to be learning that. So all the same stuff. You can never have enough batteries. You at least need a spare, okay? All right, so we're going to change. Any questions about handhelds? Not antennas. I'm going to talk about antennas separate, but the radios themselves. Any more questions about that? That's kind of your primer into what to go buy. Yaesu, ICOM, or Kenwood? just keep it to that. I like Yaesu.
Are they all pretty comparable?
They're all great. You're not going to go wrong.
None of them are made in America.
No, they're all Japanese. I would also, I've got a buyer's guide on my website that I put together. I'll give all you guys the URL. It's got actual radio suggestions with prices on it that you can look through for the intended use. So if it's your EDC or your plate carrier or your mobile, I've got actual suggestions for you. Anything about mobiles? I mean handhelds?
Just a little bit of a sidebar, but
Yep.
just an ear probe to run.
Howard lights for the cheap stuff have a 3.5 millimeter jack, which is your headphone jack size. And then Comtax, I think, is like the high end stuff with a mic. With the Howard lights, you're only going to hear. Obviously, they have the electronic, but you're going to have to speak into your shoulder mic. With the Comtax, you have a mic right in front of you, so you don't have to do anything. I'm not an expert on those, but that's my understanding. There's great stuff online, kind of walking you through the tactical comms setup. That's just not my domain. But just expect to spend money. I've looked at it enough to know not to try. That's basically what I got is as far as I'm willing to go for my purposes. So.
Some of the high-end radios have Bluetooth now.
Yeah, I've seen this one has a Bluetooth push to transmit button, and it also allows you to program it over Bluetooth. I don't know about Bluetooth headsets. That might be a thing now. That is kind of a place things are innovating, is with a lot of whiz-bang stuff around Bluetooth and GPS, and there's even a way to send text messages over ham radio now. Obviously, I avoided some of those subjects because we're just trying to get the basics down. But yeah, you can go wild with it. That's the place they are adding features compared to other areas. It's not as revolutionary, but it's kind of a neat addition they're making. All right, I'm going to do mobiles, and then we'll probably be wrapping up for lunch here soon. So thank you guys for hanging in there. Any more questions about handhelds? All right. I can't emphasize enough to just buy a quality handheld, okay? For mobile, as we talked about, this is kind of what I recommend for your house or your vehicle. You can use a handheld in your vehicle. You're just going to be limited on power, but a mobile radio is going to open up so many possibilities because of the amount of power they have. So this mobile unit has a 100-watt transmit. That's 20 times more than most handhelds. So I can reach stuff that there's some problems that only power can solve, right? If you're trying to shoot through a bunch of trees, you're trying to shoot over a slight hill, other than getting way up in a helicopter, there might not be a way to get past it without more power. So that's definitely a benefit, much better range. Very feature rich, and you can actually hear a mobile radio really well in your car or at home. The volume is insane on them compared to a handheld. So literally the speaker size is so much bigger on these. I can hear it through my whole house, like 2,000 square foot house. If I have that thing maxed out, it'd be like an alarm clock on the other end of the house. Some of them are louder than others, but if you're thinking about a noisy vehicle with the windows down, you're going to want to be able to hear it if somebody's trying to get in touch with you. You might not have that benefit with a handheld. Much better user interface. They're going to have room for buttons and screens that a handheld does not have. And as we talked about, much bigger capacity usually to memorize stations. Cons on these, they're big and heavy. So the radio itself is not that big, not that heavy, maybe 2 pounds, about the size of a small book. But what I need with it is a car battery or a big power supply. I need a big antenna, like this at least. Got to have a lot of stuff. And that radio, you're into probably spending around $500 or so to get a full setup minimally. So, bigger investment for sure. But
Say the power was on that.
100 watts. And most of them are going to have at least 50 or so watts, and that's going to solve all your problems.
Is that max? Is there a max?
Yep. And because of that wattage, you'll see I don't have like chintzy little tiny wires on these. This is heavy gauge power wires. A lot of people use a power pole connector. You see them on winches and stuff a lot. Those are real popular with quick connects for power. And also I use these SAE style. You'd see these plugs on a lot of trickle chargers and motorcycle stuff. Those are handy to use if you want, say you want to take this out of your car and take it into your house. You can have a quick release on your power cable and unscrew your antenna, move it back and forth. It does get expensive. I only have one mobile right now. I would prefer, what I'm working toward is having one of these in the house in a central location on a desk in our living area, and then one in each vehicle. That's what I'm shooting for, big picture. And then obviously this is what I'll have when I'm out and about and I'm not at a car or in my house. But it's kind of like pistol and rifle, right? Like fighting with a pistol pretty much sucks, but sometimes that's all you can have. At home, you should have a shotgun or a rifle because it's a lot easier to do business with. Same story with radios. So vehicle or base station, we already talked about that. You can pack this up, like if you were on a camping trip, you could take this with you to the mountains and set it up to have at your campsite or something like that. Take it on vacation. It's not totally permanent, but it's kind of semi-permanent because of the bulk. So buying these, same story, stick to the same kind of Japanese brands. Make sure it's dual band. Most of these nowadays are going to have crossband functionality, crossband repeat. So all that investment you made in your antenna and your wire, that's going to also serve as a repeater station. That will be helpful to use depending on your situation. Most of them come with a wired microphone with controls on it, so I can actually change channels and stuff right here on the mic instead of having to reach down if I've got it in the floorboard or something in the car. I can change the channel right in my hand. As usual, you need to budget for the additional costs. So if you have $250 radio, you're going to need $100 worth of coax. You're going to need another $100 for an antenna. God knows how much for a power supply. If you want a lithium battery, that can be $1,000. If you want like a LiPo 12-volt battery for a solar system, or you can buy a car battery for $50. I don't know if you want to be sitting in your living room with a car battery right next to you, but go for it. Hope you got, keep maybe a blast shield next to you or something. I have an AGM battery in this container. This is one of those little troller motor boxes, and it's got a 12-volt port. Mainly it just separates me from the battery so I don't accidentally short something across the terminals. And that's what I have this sitting in my office on a trickle charger, and then I run the radio off of it. I made that up. I wasn't told to do that, but I assume as little as I use my mobile unit, I'm going to drain the battery very little, and I'm just going to keep it maintained. But obviously this battery in here has to be charged. You don't just use it all up. 3 or 4 years. Yep. So if you want to spend the money, this is the radio I recommend for mobile. It's an FTM 400 XDR. It's made by Yaesu. It's about $550. That LCD screen that you see is about the same size as a big cell phone, and it mounts remotely. So there is a communication wire to it, but you can mount this up on a cell phone holder on your car and have that radio under your seat. The interface is incredibly good. This is pretty much the go-to that I've discovered in the world. So for this time and place, that's the best. You can go down to something like this Kenwood on this list, I believe is more like $200. It's going to have a lot of the same features, but it doesn't have that detachable base plate or any of that. The cheapest I would go is that TYT 9800. I believe it's basically a knockoff of the Yaesu 8900. It's well like they're $200. If you're trying to put one in every vehicle, maybe do that. That's the cheapest I would go, is that TYT. And you can get that on Radiodity's website. Do not buy that radio on eBay or Amazon. All right, we got a few more minutes. I'm gonna talk a little bit about wires and adapters and all this stuff, and then we'll close up. So this, to me, even for me, and I love technical stuff, learning all the wires and connectors with ham radio has been a disaster. It's very hard. And so I'm gonna save you a tremendous amount of pain and suffering with this. There's a lot of names and numbers. My point in this is there's some choices you can make early on about what connectors you're going to use that will save you a lot of time and save you money. So I'm going to talk you through what these are first. This is mainly for you to look back at later. If you see the words UHF, male or female, or you see SO239 or PL259, that's kind of the category here. That's UHF. You see what the female and the male look like? I hate to spoil it for you guys, but the male is the Audi, the female is the Innie. Most of your mobile radios are going to have this connector on the back. This is pretty much universal. So for your big antennas and for your mobile antennas, most of them are going to have the male equivalent. So the female is the SO239 and the male is the PL259. All right. The reason I'm telling you this is you need to know that when you're buying stuff. So if I'm going to buy an antenna to go on my car, I want to make sure it has a PL259 on the end. If I'm going to buy a radio for an antenna for my handheld, it needs to be different. So I'm just telling you this is your guide. You don't need to remember this, but when you get into trying to make stuff work with each other, you're going to need to know that. The next one is for handhelds. There's basically these two, SMA male and SMA female. It's a big long screw thread with a little hole or a little wire in the middle. If you can see the outside threads, it's male if it's an Audi. And if you see the inside threads, it's female. It's an Innie. All your Yaesu and most of your quality radios are going to have a male, and most of your Baofengs are going to have female. And if you're not picking up on it, this presents a little bit of a problem if you're working with multiple radios. What sucks is this antenna is $20, and I'm not thrilled about buying one that doesn't work with all my stuff. If I'm going to invest the money in something that costs as much as the radio, I hope I can use it in all my radios, but I can't if I buy SMA. Another downside to SMA is to take this off. I have to turn this radio 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 rotations to get this off. If this is mounted to a plate carrier and I've got all of my stuff routed in and I've got to rotate this thing almost five times to get the antenna off it. It's very inconvenient. You can cross thread these threads if you're not careful. It is a very secure connection once it's there. I will give it that, but it's not ideal. So my suggestion is to adapt everything to BNC. So BNC, to take BNC off, is a quarter turn. Quarter turn to get it on, quarter turn to get it off. What that also allows me to do is use my BNC antenna on any radio that I've adapted to BNC. So I recommend buying a dozen of these adapters in male and female and putting them on everything. And then when you hand out a radio to your friends and family, if they break their antenna, you've got a spare that's going to work. You don't have to worry, oh, is my spare going to work with their Baofeng because I use my Yaesu? No, everything's universalized. So you are making a compromise by having to add an adapter. It's another $4 for an adapter, and it's not as secure as a thread-on. It just isn't, because it only takes a quarter turn to get it off. So that's good and bad. But what that does is give you a platform to build on, so that when I buy these roll-up antennas, this is another $30 investment. I buy it with the BNC adapter. You choose what it comes with, and I get it with a BNC, so I know I can use it on everything. If I didn't, if I'm running out of the house to bug out and I grab the wrong one, it may not even work with my radio. So adapt everything to BNC. I have links to all that stuff, but when you buy a radio, just go ahead and buy the right adapter. For antennas, I keep showing you this one. This one is made right here in the USA by one dude, I think. It's pretty much the go-to antenna. It measures up to all the big ones, but the amazing thing about these is it folds up into that tiny little loop, and it also will bounce right back. It's made out of this elastic material that if I uncoil this, goes right into shape. You can get them in glow in the dark. You can get them in like 10 colors, but this is the best antenna there is as far as I'm concerned for a handheld. I buy them with BNC, like I said, and they work on all my radios. Before I knew that, I bought a SMA thread-on antenna for my Yaesu, made by Diamond. That's a good company. Nagoya is a good company. Comet is a good company. All those are fine, but just to simplify for you, a signal stick, I've got links to this, but I recommend buying this antenna. They do volume discounts. If you guys all want to get together and buy a bunch of them, let me know. I'd love to get in on that with you. I think you can get like up to 25% off depending on how many you buy. I don't have anything to gain from this. I'm just genuinely, this is what I use for everything. So when I bought all those Baofengs, I bought 10 BNC adapters, 10 signal stick antennas, and 10 Baofengs. That's how I set them all up. And there's a screenshot here, the next slide, of what to buy right there. The drop down, you want to buy the dual band version. Remember we talked about that? And of course pick your color. So if you bought a black one, they're $20. All right, last couple of things here. For the bug out and adventure style stuff, I already showed you this. This is a roll up Slim Jim antenna. If you see right there in the picture, there's an RV with a little PVC stand that someone has unrolled this and hung it from. There's a little hole in the end. You can take some paracord and a rock and throw it up over a tree and hoist it up. When you need to get up high, you need this. If you're only going to buy one of them, I would buy it with the UHF connector, because then you can use it with any radio. If you can, you just buy an adapter cable to fit it to your HT, but it'll directly plug into your mobile. If you can afford two, they're about $30 a piece. That's what I've done, is I bought one that lives in my backpack that has a BNC that I know is always going to work with my handheld. So I literally can swap it right on and I'm ready to go. And then I bought one with the UHF connector that'll work with anything. Height makes might. So, if you're in a situation where you're stranded, don't have cell phone signal, trying to get to a repeater, nothing's working, go find the highest spot you can visually see, throw it up as high as you can and try again, you might hit something. So These are invaluable for the money, and you can make them yourself if you have a lot of time on your hands. There's all kinds of guides for that. For a vehicle, my recommendation is this Nagoya in UT72. They're $35. It's going to have that UHF connector on it that'll work with your mobile, or you can buy a patch cable to convert it to your handheld. The issue with a car is that you're in a metal cage, so you need to get your antenna outside the car. This, you can put it right through your door weather stripping or your trunk, or you don't have to drill holes. You know, if it's temporary, that's what I would do. And honestly, for long term, I've had no problems. I have kept them for several years on vehicles and had no leaks, but your mileage may vary. There are all kinds of other vehicle antennas. You can go down the rabbit hole. They make them that mount on your hood, on the gap between your fender and your hood, or on your trunk lid, or on the top of your truck. I'm just not going down that path at the moment. For $35, this is hard to beat, and you'll notice it's pretty much identical to the handheld antenna. It's basically just getting it outside. I think these have a power limitation of 50 watts, so if you're going to use a super duper mobile like I have, you may blow it up, so just be careful about that. Make sure it's rated to handle the wattage you're putting through it. And it may not blow up, maybe they just get hot. I don't know that it's the end of the world, but you know how that stuff goes. They underrate things. And then the last one here is your base station antenna. So this is the one I recommend because it's semi-portable. It's called an open stub J-pole. It's made out of aluminum pipes that are threaded that all stick together. You may not be able to see too well, but in that picture it's on top of a tripod and it has 3 stubs. It's got 2 short ones and 1 real long one. They all thread into that plate that you see there at the bottom, and then that plate can either be mounted on a tripod or there's an L bracket that you can mount it to any pole. So if you have your vent tube coming out of the top of your roof for your plumbing vent, that's the perfect spot to get a U-bolt, bolt this thing to, and you've got a mast to mount your antenna to. Mount it real low so it's not putting strain on that. Obviously that PVC is not going to be great for holding tension loads, but the way I have it right now, it's kind of a redneck engineering situation. I bought like a $10 monopod for a camera, extended it all the way, then I threaded that into the base of this and ratchet strapped it to my chimney. I didn't want to drill any holes because we're going to be moving, and so I thought I'd like to test this. Then I just run the wire into a window to test with. Running wires, you got to drill holes for that too. So this is what I recommend. You can break that down. It would fit in a backpack, and you could take it camping and set it up on a tripod. So there are infinite base station antennas. You can get a full height 2-meter antenna to mount on your roof if your significant other will allow you to do something weird like that. Mine won't. So also HOAs, if you have one of those, be careful. All right, last thing, coax cable. Like with all this stuff, you get what you pay for. You can't skimp on the coax. That's what runs between your antenna and your radio. You got to spend the money. Keep it as short as you can. So if you only have to go 50 feet, buy a 50-foot cable. Try to keep it under 100 feet so you're not going to run your antenna a quarter mile up the road and your radio way back here. It's just not feasible. So it's going to have to be near your radio. Especially if you're using a handheld, it's going to be pretty much a joke once you get past about 50 feet with one of these. With only 5 watts of power, you're eliminating all your power by the time it gets all the way to your antenna. Buy them from the Wireman. If you can't go to a Hamfest, call them. They also have them online. There's a few kinds of coax. You'll notice, like on my patch cable, it's a thin gauge wire versus on let's see. On this, it's a little thicker. So RG8 for the big stuff and RG58 for the little stuff is what you are looking for. And you want to look for the words low loss. So on this next one, I've got kind of what to buy. Heavy gauge quality wire with quality connections. All these connections are they undergo a lot of abuse, right? Like this little connector is soldered on here and it's getting bent and tugged on. If you cheap out, that's going to break on you. I've got 2 or 3 of them that just came apart. You want to make sure it's been shrink wrapped and it's on there good. Quality American made cable is going to be great. The Wireman makes the best I've seen. Expect to pay $1 a foot. The patch cables are thinner and shorter. Basically, they are an adapter, but they have some wire in between the ends. Instead of being a direct adapter, it just has a length of wire between the 2 connectors. So, for example, if you were buying that roll-up antenna, I told you if you can only buy one, get the UHF connector. You'll need a patch cable to get it down to B and C for your radio. I've got all those listed out on the buyer's guide that I put together for you guys, but it's good to have a 100-foot coax for your main one and a 3-foot SO239 to BNC patch cable. You need those 2 things. All right, we're gonna stop there. Questions about all this antenna, wires, adapters kind of stuff? I know that's a lot. Let me reiterate, what I'm trying to do is tell you what to buy. I don't expect you to even know what I'm talking about or understand all that as much as I'm just trying to save you the headache of spending $50 on a cable when you should have spent $100, and it saves you from having to spend $150 to do it right, stuff like that. Hopefully we can save you a step or 2. But any questions about what I've shared there? Go ahead.
So you're saying for this, like the 16-foot cable, I get the UHF attachment?
Yeah, on the roll-up.
On the roll-up, why not, does it not come with the BNC?
If you can only buy one, the problem is if you buy it with BNC, you can't hook this to a mobile radio as easily. So I like to have 2. I like to have one that is made to go with my handheld, and these live together in my bag with the BNC. And then if I can afford to buy 2, I buy a second one with the UHF. I can buy an adapter to make it work with this also. So that's why I said if you can only buy one, buy this one so you can adapt it to your handheld or keep it with your base station so it works with everything. I know that's confusing, and I'm sorry, I wish it was easier, but what could be worse is if you had to buy an SMA male, an SMA female, and a UHF. Now you got to have 3, and none of them work with everything. So if you adapt everything to BNC, you're better off. Is everyone thoroughly overwhelmed? The reason I'm going through this, guys, is I've got some adapters here that I'll pass them around for you to look at. You guys are welcome to play with any of this stuff. But the problem really gets to when you've bought your radio and you're looking at it and you're like, I know I need an antenna. And you go to the antenna website and there's literally 300 antennas to pick from. And they all are named all sorts of things with all kinds of numbers and letters. I'm trying to dumb it down to where you know what to go get. And if I didn't do that, you would probably buy the wrong thing and be very frustrated and potentially just give up. And I don't want you to give up because using these is what's actually fun. Like all this gear stuff is just a necessary evil. People geek out about this part of it. This is not what's fun. The coolest part is talking to your neighbor 3 miles away with nobody's infrastructure helping you and knowing, wow, as long as our radios work, we can talk. Like, that's what's cool. But you got to know all this or have at least all this working to ever get to that. So What I would love to do, I've had the idea, is to basically make bundles and just say, all right, here's what you need in a box, and mark it up $4 for my time, and just help people by saying, all right, I'm just going to cut the crap. Here's a turnkey system. Take it and run with it. I think that would be helpful. I've attempted to do that with this buyer's list. If you go to my website, it's evanandhannah.com/radio. That's my
Say that again.
evanandhannah.com.
Evan, what?
And the word "and" spell it out.
Yep, Evan, EVAN, and hannah.com/ham radio. I'm sorry, it's ham radio.
Evan and Hannah /ham.
You say ham?
I will email this to you guys so you have it.
I'm
evanandhannah.com/ham radio. I've got a buyer's guide on here with links to everything I've talked about today. You don't have to go find it. You don't have to read back through this. It'll take you straight to all the stuff. And I'll also post my presentation there so you can download it if you lose your handout. Okay, so how's everybody feeling about all this? Think of any questions?
Processed yet.
Sure. Anything that's come up that we can talk about before we jump back in?
So patch cables are just connecting your antenna wire to your unit.
That's right. I'll pass this one around. Actually, I'll just pass a few things around today. So there's two versions of a patch cable. So this one is going to be UHF female to SMA female. That was back in the early days of my mistakes. This one's the same, but to BNC. So if I needed to make this vehicle antenna work with my handheld, I would use that BNC adapter. So this is a patch cable, both of those. And then this little guy is an adapter for SMA to BNC. So you screw this one onto a Yaesu that has the male, and it will adapt to BNC. I don't have a spare of the female. This one kind of replaces that patch cable in a way. So that patch cable takes the UHF end and the BNC end, and it just makes a flexible version of that. But this one is this one's all on one. So this is just prone to. It's not flexible. I'd be careful with using that permanently, but it's a problem solver if you needed it. I basically try to keep an assortment of every adapter I could need, just have at least one of them on hand. They're so cheap. Keep them in a little tackle box. You can solve problems that you don't even anticipate needing to solve if you have the stuff on hand. Actually, I'll send this around also.
If you're using a mobile unit in your vehicle, does it make a difference whether to use that magnetic base one versus, say, like a whip antenna?
No, I bring this one up for the sake of it's magnetic. There's no mounting hardware. There's no holes to drill. So for simplicity and for the money, that's what I recommend. But a whip with a nice mount, that's probably far better, but it's going to require more expertise. So when someone asks me, what do I put on my car to accomplish what we talked about today, which is I want to talk from car to car or car to repeater, that's fine. $35, throw it on top. You can take it off in 5 minutes to go through the car wash. And those whips, typically a whip antenna will be really long and it'll bend over. So if you hit something or you go through a drive-through, it'll just actually have a click like that. So you can either fold it down or it folds itself down. But if anyone knows about driving tall vehicles, I don't recommend it if you don't need to. Just say that.
And back, and I guess to this day, a lot of people use loaded antennas with Citizens Media.
Yeah.
Do people do that with phantom at all?
Well, the thing with CB is just that it's an entirely different frequency range. So you need, with CB, I'm pretty sure the reason for the long antenna is it's a full wavelength. So you need that to get distance because you're already suffering so much with low power. So I'm not really sure how they compare, but as I mentioned, if you look at this compared to the handheld, they're essentially the same antenna. You're just getting it outside your vehicle. You're not going to see a major performance difference between that and your HT antenna. It's mainly for just getting it outside the box. All right, I want to give you a very brief, we'll feel a little patronizing, probably explanation of just how to use a radio. So, if you have never used a walkie-talkie or anything, this might be helpful. A lot of people get this simple cadence messed up, and what can happen is you get the front end or the back end of your message cut off because you're simply just not following the very simple press, speak, release. So this big button, it's going to usually say PTT, that means push to transmit. You're going to press it, speak, and then let it go when you're done speaking. So you're not going to immediately start speaking. You're going to give it a second. Make sure you kind of own the airwaves. Basically you have to kind of take the frequency over, start talking, and then let off. So what will happen a lot on a repeater is you'll double with somebody, is what they call it. You'll talk over the top of each other, and it'll come out a gargly mess. So when you have that short delay, it just prevents that from happening because you're already going to kind of you're going to dominate the channel at that moment when you press the button. So simply pressing it, KN4WRX testing, and then let it off. I know that seems a little contrived, but that's just that's the story. You're going to usually have a knob for volume control. On my Yaesu, I press and hold a button and turn the knob for volume. It's just going to depend on the radio. It's one of the things I really like about that Yaesu is the reason you press and hold for volume, because without that, this is a scroll through the channels. So I can get through channels very quickly. On a Baofeng, it's press down, 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 or you have to know the number. With this, I can scroll through, faster than I can read it. Leave it back on local 3. I was going to do a demonstration here. I have this set up to crossband repeat on channels that are not, I don't hear anything on it right now. So if I crank this one up all the way and then speak on this. So I've got this set up on 446, and then this one is on, let's see here, 147.3. So they're on totally separate channels. This is working as a crossband repeater, and you should see it light up. Have interference all of a sudden. So that's not a clean channel. So what's happening, you can actually hear it. Remember I mentioned squelch. What it'll do is filter out if nothing's happening. So that little noise is enough to make my radio think somebody's transmitting. So it sounds a little bit different than just the normal noise, enough to make it think, hey, there's something going on here. So that's a good example of, that would not be a frequency to use. If you're trying to pick one for your house to keep everybody on, go to it. Your radio should be dead. And if you call out on it, nobody should answer you, right? There are so many frequencies. There's hundreds and hundreds. Find one that's not in use. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but as far as my little example failing, the reason I can't use that is probably some leaky equipment somewhere that's putting out some kind of weird signal. It could be a doorbell, or a lot of times those power doors on gas station entrances will cause noise, stuff like that. So adjusting the volume, we talked about. Lockout, you want to find how to disable transmit on your radio. That's an important feature that, if it's in a pocket or it's on your chest rig or whatever, just to prevent you from accidentally pressing that button and doing exactly what's happening there. You're disturbing other people. You want to make sure if you're transmitting it's on purpose, and make sure you know how to scan. So on a Baofeng, it's going to be pressing and holding the asterisk button. And I'll let it kind of go through here and show. You won't be able to see, but it's going one by one through all the channels. And when it picks something up like that, it stops for a second. And I don't have this one set up for this location. This is set up for where I live. But ideally, as you're scanning, you'd hear people talking on repeaters. It would catch activity on those repeaters. So these are the things you need to know how to do with your radio. That's why I have this list here. You need to be able to move between channels, how to transmit, how to adjust your volume, how to scan and lock it out. Your manual will have that. This is the stuff that you absolutely need to have mastered. This is the kind of stuff that belongs on that cheat sheet I talked about, that you would make that's specific to each radio. All right. The Chirp software, I'm not going to go through actually doing it right this minute, but just to talk about it, it's basically essential for programming these cheaper radios. So one thing to be aware of is to make sure you buy a quality USB interface. There's a link to it on my page. Plan on it being about $20, or if you buy that multi-pack from Radioddity, it will come with a free one. These are notoriously bad. So if you've had trouble in the past, this might be your culprit. Pay to get a good one. It's basically going to make night and day difference for programming a Baofeng. With Chirp, what you can do is have it import from repeater book directly. You can give it a radius and say, I want every repeater on UHF and VHF pulled in, go ahead, it'll load in all the settings instantly, and you can program that straight to your radio. So you're not having to manually look them up and key them in. It'll filter out stuff that's not compatible. So for instance, with a Baofeng, you can't use any digital modes, so you can say don't import digital. You can quickly load in your NOAA weather stations. There's, I think, 10 across the country. Go ahead and load those in so you can get emergency weather alerts. And you can select what is scanned and what's not. So there's a little kind of true-false on each channel name that I'll show you guys that you don't want to scan those weather stations, right? If you're in an emergency situation, you want to be scanning, listening for people. It's going to stop on that weather station for 5 seconds every time. It's going to annoy the crap out of you. So disable scan on stuff that's not prone to needing to be scanned. That's an important thing for sure. And then one of my favorite things about using Chirp is you can save the template. So when you first get your radio, get it all set up, play with the setup, find what you like, and then save that template out of Chirp and share it to your group. No one else has to do all that work. They just download the template, shove it onto the radio, and you all have the same numbers for every channel. You don't have to know, especially if you're arming the whole family, right? You're giving this radio to grandma. You put them in priority number, right? Channel 1 is the best repeater. Channel 2 is the second best repeater, and you just tell her, press in 001 and start talking, and hopefully it works for her. You can do that much easier with a template. So I was going to offer, if we're all in similar geographic areas, to just make one for you guys, and then I can send that out in the email, so it's kind of a turnkey bow thing set up. I also recommend adding, there's a frequency, I think I have it on one of these slides, that's kind of the well-known simplex emergency frequency. So if someone is in trouble out in the wilderness, say on like the Appalachian Trail, they know that people will often be on this frequency for emergency traffic. I think the Coast Guard monitors it, stuff like that. So I would have that one on there and mark it as emergency. There's all sorts of little tips like that. There are great videos on how to do this. There's no reason for me to bore you with an instructional on this, but what I do want to do is help support you if you're having problems, right? A video can't really help you if you run into a roadblock, but there's no reason for me to sit and give you a step-by-step. I think giving you the template might be helpful, so I'm willing to do that. A couple things to think about. You want to be able to do these things without a computer, without any help. You want to be able to add or remove a repeater, add or remove a simplex frequency, which is just radio to radio. You want to be able to lock out the radio so you don't transmit, and you want to be able to scan.
What did you say a simplex frequency is?
Radio to radio. So simplex does not have the offset. It's going to be transmit and receive on the same frequency. And as I've mentioned there, this is what you want to go on that little cheat sheet. And I would practice this, and I would also print out from Chirp or do it in a spreadsheet a reference of what's in your radio. So you're going to be able to see the number and the name on the screen of your radio. But if you print out the whole Chirp template and just keep that handy, you can quickly look, okay, I want to listen on number 45. I see what frequency that is. I'm going to type that in. Instead of trying to do it all on the radio, it's super nice to have a reference sheet of all your channels. That's stuff I kind of learned through trying to do this myself. So some of the stuff I already mentioned. You got 128 channels on your bow thing. If that's what you're using, I recommend loading that thing up. So start with your small radius, test it, find out what you can actually hit, keep those high on the list, and then work your way out. Follow, if there's a certain path you travel often, look up other cities, find the repeaters in those areas. Fill that whole radio up, though. There's no sense in leaving a channel unused. If there's a chance you could need it, go ahead and pre-program it. I've got listed out here, 156.8 is that emergency simplex channel. 151.940 is pretty popular with preppers I've seen. And then if you and your group want to come up with, all right, around our area, this is our simplex channel. If we have a problem, we all check it at this time of the night. And you can always, if you have a little neighborhood group, I recommend trying to use simplex for anything that's super local. You're less likely to interrupt other people on repeaters. So I have a little good, better, best there with repeaters. Local ones that you can access, you definitely want those in it. So start with that as your top priority. And then branch out from there, increase your radius. You can also throw the FRS and GMRS stations in there. A lot of your walkie-talkie radios that your kids might have are going to work on FRS, so you could actually communicate to those from these radios if you have those pre-programmed. I would make those a low priority. If you're totally done with repeaters, fill them in with that. Any questions about this stuff? Obviously, your better radios are going to have more capacity. There's also groupings that I mentioned earlier. So like I can have a Charlotte group, a Morganton group, a Nashville group, a local group. I could have all those, and then when I'm scanning, I can isolate it to only the group I'm worried about at the moment. That's helpful if you have that capability. The reason I'm not providing like detailed instruction is literally every radio is different with this stuff. And if you follow my advice and don't buy a Baofeng for your primary radio, it's going to be very obvious how this works. It's going to be clear in the manual. It's going to explain it just as well as I can for like a Yaesu or an ICOM or Kenwood. Where the challenge comes in is obviously, we talked about with the Baofeng, it's just not intuitive, but this will be much more intuitive with your radio. And I recommend whatever you buy, go watch 3 or 4 review videos on that radio and watch them using it. They'll probably show you how to program it. They'll show you how some of the features work. Use that to your advantage. That's how I learn just about everything, is either the manual or a video about my radio.
Is ham all voice now?
Essentially it is, yep.
So there are some people still using code?
Yep, so that's worth mentioning. I probably should have done that during the licensing part. But so he asked, is ham radio mostly all voice now? And you may wonder, what else could it be? I think they used to call it basically Morse code, but there's another term for keying in Morse code. I can't remember their name for it. I did not learn that, but it used to be a requirement to get your license. I think that changed. There was a lot of controversy about removing that requirement because people thought, well, if you don't have to learn Morse code, then all these Mongoloids are going to come onto the radio and they're going to take it over. And of course, nobody did because it's still hard. It is more accessible. It would be pretty tough, I think, to learn Morse code on top of, not only sending it, but transmitting, receiving it and translating it. But people are into that, people that want to learn something new. It's low on my priority list. But the good news with that, in a bad situation, if you have really terrible signal quality, you could transmit a message that would make it through better than voice. And I've played with ideas to actually create like an encoder and a decoder using computer software so that it could do it for you. But then you obviously need your phone to be working to decode the Morse code. That's a good question. That used to be a requirement. So imagine you had to learn Morse code to use your Baofeng radio. That would be a little ridiculous. All right, so I pasted in the instructions for programming a simplex. There's 7 steps for a Baofeng, and then for a repeater, there's like 15 steps here. I'm not going to talk you through that, but you have it. A lot of times your manual will not have that, so you can look that up online, obviously, but here it is if you need it. We'll practice some of that if we need to. Programming other radios, they're going to be far easier, like I said, and you're going to be able to use your manual. I don't recommend like carting around your manual. I would keep that in a nice, dry, secure place and create a laminated cheat sheet that you keep with your radio so you don't lose the manual. You can also download PDF versions of these, keep them on a thumb drive in your gun safe or something. Very helpful to have. Most of the higher quality radios are going to have the factory OEM programming software. So Chirp might not work, but Yaesu will give you a software that does it, or in this case, Anytone. There's a very good interface that I use. It uses a regular old USB cable, nothing weird, nothing that's going to have a chip in it that could be bad like the Baofengs. And then RT Systems is kind of the Chirp level, like automated. You can load in repeaters and program things a lot faster and easier. They usually make a software for each new radio that comes on the market, and it comes with a special cable.
What is that?
RT Systems. So on gigaparts.com, they usually sell that. When you buy your radio, you can bundle it in for like $40. I recommend checking that out. I would maybe try the factory software first, and if you find it lacking, you can always try the RT systems. It is essential to know how to do things manually, though, so do not rely entirely on the computer interface. You ought to be able to add a repeater in the field. So if somebody says, hey, you should add this on there, there's a great one right here, it's brand new, you're not stuck, you're not helpless. You ought to have that on your cheat sheet. All right, so let's talk. We're out of the technical world, okay? So let's talk about kind of strategies of using these radios. I've already mentioned several times about getting your antenna up high. If you think about it, essentially, if you can't see it, chances are neither can the radio, right? So you need to be able, if you want incredibly good range, you literally should be able to put your eyes on from the tip of that antenna to where you're trying to get to. So if you're trying to get crazy range, right? So if you're just trying to get 3 or 4 miles, it's not the situation. But when you're trying to reach out 30 to 50 miles on UHF, VHF, you got to have towers. You got to have antenna masts way up in the air, and a lot of power also. So power can solve problems that elevation didn't solve. So if that's as high as you can get it, adding power with a mobile station or a mobile radio is going to give you your best shot. But at some point you reach a limit, right? So if you're at 100 watts and your antenna is as high as you can get it and you still can't reach, you're going to be needing to use a repeater. I mean, there's not much more you can do. My biggest emphasis here for you guys is you need to actually do hands-on experimentation with this and go try it. You can't hope that everybody's going to pull out their radio and, well, they say they reach 5 miles, and then when the emergency happens, it doesn't even make it down the street. You know, you've got to get this stuff out and try it. Because the theoretical stuff, I mean, it's worth the price you pay for it. I can tell you all day how it's going to work, but it may not work. Keep in mind obstacles. I mean, if there literally is a tree right in front of the antenna and that is between you and who you're trying to talk to, that tree might be causing the problem. You might can move 10 feet and have a world of a difference. So especially obstacles that are very close up, like a tree, if you can get away from those, that can solve problems. Be aware of like metal roofs. They're going to cause all kinds of issues. You're going to need to get outside to be able to get out of your house. And then hills and mountains, like literally any kind of earth between you and the other thing. Not much ways to get around that without getting up higher. Yeah.
As far as the handhelds, are they all pretty much the same wattage? Like you said,
Yeah, most handhelds are going to be 5 watts or less.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, the Baofeng, they offer one that is 8 watts, but if you measure it, it's not 8 watts. So I'm not sure how they get away with advertising that. A lot of the higher quality radios don't need as much wattage. They actually accomplish more on lower power just because of the signal quality. So power's not everything, but if you're already with a quality radio, upping the power is kind of all you can do. But yeah, 5 watts is generally, and there might be some kind of regulation on, safety that's causing that limitation. I'm not sure. I've never seen one over 5 watts. Any other questions about that? Go ahead. When you hook what into?
Like plug it into your car, you get more power out of it if it's handheld?
No, it won't matter. Yep. Okay, so this is an idea for kind of a communication plan for a family or a local group. So first and foremost, everyone needs to have the gear and the training. You cannot just box this up and hand it to somebody and expect it to work. And as I'm doing today, if you can teach it, then you're likely to remember it. So I recommend you kind of develop your own little class to give your family member or your friend or whatever. It's just a brief intro of how to use this radio. But if you teach how to use that radio, to 10 people, you'll probably remember. Now, you are probably going to be your group's expert, right? If you're here, unless you're all in the same group, you're going to go back to a bunch of uninformed people that you want to be able to talk to. So like it or not, you're going to be the ambassador. So keep that in mind. I mean, you know infinitely more than your average person, even after just a few hours today. I think, as I keep mentioning, this cheat sheet is essential. It's an often overlooked thing. Even if you're giving them a manual, please be sure to put the most important stuff on one thing, zip tie it to the radio, make a little tag, or I don't know, come up with some way so that they have a guide if you're not there to help them, so they can help themselves. And then I recommend setting a schedule of some kind to do regular check-ins. So if you're serious about this, you want this to be something that you're going to use when you need to, every Friday night at 9 o'clock, we have a check-in. Okay, and everybody who can is going to get on and listen, and we're going to confirm things are operational, all right? You need to, whatever that protocol is, you need to have an agreed upon protocol that everybody's going to follow. Here's the obvious thing is if your radio is not on, you're not going to receive an emergency transmission from somebody. So if you bought a Baofeng, you can't leave that on all the time. It's going to be dead in 3 hours. And you can't plug it in while it's running. So you're going to need a mobile unit, or you're going to need at least a handheld that can charge while it's running so you can leave it on all the time. Because what if your neighbor needs you and you've told them, hey, this is your emergency radio, but you're never listening. So you better find a way to have some kind of procedure that makes this a viable communication plan. Otherwise, you're just talking into the radio for the fun of it yourself, right? Now, if this isn't what you're after, if you just want to learn to use repeaters, that's the good news about repeaters is somebody's likely to be out there listening, right? But if you're trying to have a local group, you're going to really need a plan. I recommend having some simplex frequencies, kind of have 3 or 4 in priority order that people go through. If you don't have, that might mean you need 4 radios sitting there monitoring all 4 of them if you don't have a radio that can monitor multiple frequencies. But have a plan is the point there. I'm happy to kind of consult with you guys on specifically what's good for you in your situation. But talk to your group of people, figure out what your needs are, and agree on some of the stuff we're talking about. Any questions about that? Does that make sense what I'm saying about having the check-ins? And that's a commitment to make, right? That's going to be kind of boring and unproductive. You can make it fun, right? Like if these are people you don't talk to that much, it might be a neat way to stay in touch. But if you don't do that, just like what happened to me, I thought maybe my battery was dead because I haven't used this radio in a while. If I was in a bind and that radio was dead, I may not know it. So your regular check-in is as much for you as it is for the other people to make sure your stuff works and it's fresh on your memory. Other considerations to make, nothing you say on amateur radio bands is private. It's entirely public. So anyone with a radio can hear what you're saying. Just keep that in mind. Don't say anything that you don't want used against you. Don't say anything you don't want anyone else knowing. You're not technically supposed to be using code language. You can't encrypt your communication. It is a public use utility. So keep that in mind. This is not your private chat room. This is not Signal that's an encrypted communication platform. This is wide open. You might as well be using an air horn to say what you're saying. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to be aware of. And especially in an emergency situation, if we're talking about, a life-altering circumstance, be careful what you say. You might not want to give details. You might want to you don't want to use encrypted language, but you can be vague or use references to things that are not specific enough for a total stranger to know what you're saying. And of course, it's going to be more private if you're on simplex. If you're on a repeater, you can guarantee it's being recorded and it's probably being heard by at least one person at any time. Versus a simplex channel, you got to be within a few miles to even hear that. Chances are your neighbor is not monitoring 3,000 frequencies. I ordered one to have it here. It didn't make it in time. But you can buy a software-defined radio dongle for your computer. It's the size of a USB. And it will monitor all frequencies at one time and give you a visualization of any activity. So you can literally see, oh, there's 4 conversations happening in this band and one here and one here. So don't think somebody can't hear what you're saying just because, oh, there's no way they would know what channel I'm on. For $30, I can hear everything that's happening because it's flying through the air, right? So it's not rocket science. Strategies are very different with or without grid power, right? So if you can't just plug your radio in to charge, that changes how you're going to use this. You might need to go ahead and have as your plan, a very common one is to check in every 4 hours starting at 7 a.m. So people know, okay, if you're conserving power, transmit at 7, 11, 3, 7, 11, so that for 10 minutes on every 4 hours, you have a chance to make contact, but then you can turn your radio off and conserve power. You're not likely going to be running constant monitoring unless you have some kind of emergency backup power like solar. I think you should consider how you want to recharge your radio if there is no grid power. And I'm not talking about like the world has ended. I mean, we're out of power for a week because of a hurricane, right? You should have a USB charger adapter and a big battery bank. You should have probably a generator if you don't already to do other stuff. But the thing with these radios is they're all lithium. They're all going to hold their charge pretty well. The main thing is to be able to top them off, right? So charging these with a generator is a pretty inefficient use of that. It would be better to have a nice big 20,000 milliamp USB battery backup, or even a big lithium car battery, stuff like Patrick's got here. Those could probably recharge your radio 10 times, and they can also run your computer. They can charge your phone, all the stuff, right? So USB is the way to go because it just charges everything. So that's not something I hear very often recommended about radios. I'm not sure why, but it's 3.7 volts. All you need is a device that transforms it to the proper voltage for your radio. So you can I've got spare batteries out the wazoo. That's obviously the fastest, right? If I need to get this thing up and running, if I'm going for a hike, I'm going out in the wilderness, having 4 batteries is quite nice. But $30, $40 a piece, right? So if I can spend $100 on a battery brick, might be better. And then I think, as with anything, you need to be able to take action when it's time to take action. The only way to do that is to practice and get training. So don't expect that your memory from this class or your memory of the last time you programmed a station into your radio is going to get you through an emergency or through a hard time. It won't. You won't remember. I hate to think that people we were talking about it at lunch. I've heard so many people say, around the time coronavirus started, I stocked up on radios. I got 10 Baofengs. They don't even know how to turn them on. They just got them, and it makes them feel better that they have them. And with some things, that is okay. Like if you bought rice, well, you could probably figure out how to cook rice, but this is not cooking rice. As we've observed today, it's complicated. So make sure you know how to do it. Make sure you've written down some instructions. This is the end of my slides. So any questions so far?
Good question. As far as the simplex,
Mhm.
is that radio to radio on any frequency, or is that a set
Simplex literally just means there's no offset for transmit and receive. So you're going to transmit and receive on the same frequency. That means simplex. Usually that is radio to radio. It's only when you get a repeater involved that you need that offset. The reason for the offset is that as the repeater is listening, it needs to immediately, in real time, transmit what it's hearing. So it needs a different frequency for that, right? So the receive frequency has to be different than transmit because it has to go straight through and back out. So with just these, I'm going to talk, only one person going to be talking at a time, and it's going to come out on the other radios, and then when I stop, they can talk to me. So I don't need the offset radio to radio. So it's really a repeater-only problem to not use simplex. That's why with the handhelds, the crossband kind of hacks simplex. It says, okay, I can't do same band. You need two antennas for that too, I didn't mention, because it's going to be receiving on one antenna. You can't transmit out of it while it's receiving. So a repeater is going to have two of them. So the way around that with these is that thing only has one antenna. It's going to use the other band to send it back out. It's going to use 440 instead of 140. So it's just a hack, but it's a really nifty hack because
So you can do it on the same antenna.
it can, because it's using different parts of the antenna. And what I'm considering doing is I have a problem to solve with this. It's why I got it, is I have a neighbor that I can't get to no matter what. It's one of those problems. He's only 2 miles away. I've got my antenna as high as I can. I got as much power as I can get, and I can't get to him. But there is another friend who we both can get to. So I'm going to stick this in that friend's barn and crossband repeat. So that's just the only way to solve the problem economically. Of course, I could buy a real repeater and hook it to a generator, spend $5,000. But I got it for $50 used. It'll run on a battery connection for several weeks at a time, and I could charge it with a little cheap solar panel. So we're going to try that. That's something to experiment with. But you might run into something like that if you're creating a local group. You might really need to invest in some crossband repeater stuff. And then these mobile units often do crossband repeat also. So if a handheld isn't powerful enough, find the highest, out of your group, find the person with the highest altitude property, share the cost of one of these guys, split it between the 5 of you, buy a high-powered mobile unit, stick it on a really powerful or a really high elevation antenna, and then you have a pretty helpful crossband repeater. There's a lot of ways to slice it. Any questions?
On repeaters,
Uh-huh.
is there a standard, like say we wanted to buy a $5,000 repeater?
Mm-hmm.
Is there kind of a standard that everybody uses or goes to, or are there multiple manufacturers?
There are. It's as vast as radios. What I would do is go to your local club. They usually own the repeater. There's usually somebody there that maintains it, and talk to them, get their advice. Maybe they know of, maybe they want to upgrade their clubs and they could sell you theirs. They could definitely teach you, just like I've learned things the hard way. They will have also. There is not much information out there about repeaters for some reason as far as building your own.
Do they broadcast in basically 100 watts as well?
I think they can be even more powerful than that. Yep.
So there's
And they usually are accompanied by a tower, like several hundred feet.
right.
And that's an expense also, but it's not as bad as you think.
How do they get their money back for what they spend? I mean, you don't have to pay to use the repeater, right?
No.
Usually it's club dues into that club, the club kind of funds it.
Yeah, and then, this is what a lot of these guys, if you meet any ham guys, it's like that's their life. I mean, dropping $5,000 on it, that to them, that's like well worth it. It'd be. So there's been some very generous people that have done a lot, and they've built the relationships. Like I can't imagine how long it took them to get that set up I was telling you guys about, just finding that perfect emergency power, altitude, on a mountain in Gastonia. Like I don't know the story behind that, but I can only imagine how many conversations and backdoor deals had to happen for that to go down. I mean, I've heard of people literally leasing property to put one up.
You may have already said this, but how do you go about finding a local club?
That ARRL website will have most of the clubs listed. Also, just look on Facebook. Just search ham radio clubs near me. I've found the ones in the rural areas are pretty good. The ones in Charlotte, I've had less success with people being friendly in for some reason. Or at least inviting. And you have to give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm sure they get onslaught from new people all the time being in a city, and they probably just get worn out with yet another guy showing up with a radio that he doesn't know how to use. So I can imagine, 500 in on that, and you start rolling your eyes a little bit more. But the guys out here are great. I think it's in Newton where the Catawba guys meet. They're at a fire station. Really good guys.
That would also be where you would be testing, right?
Right, you normally test in those.
It's going to be a valuable asset to this group.
And, wealth of information, but just they're not going to talk to you the way I talk to you. They're generally very technical people. So, you might find a diamond in the rough, but most of those guys are lifelong hams that they don't have much relatability to your entry-level person. So it can be very intimidating to walk into one of those club meetings because you just don't have a clue what they're talking about most of the time. But you'll get there. Just have to wade into the waters carefully. Anything else at all?
I can't log into your website, so I can't figure out how to do it, so when you get.
Okay. I'll make sure you guys have that URL to send out, and I'll be adding stuff to that over time. And obviously, you can get in touch with me through that website too. So, does anyone feel like you did not? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
For like the VHF and the UHF, 440 and 120.
140 or so. Yep.
So how much give is there in that frequency? Because I know you said there's hundreds of channels. Is it like 440 dot, and then you have?
It's a 3-digit extension from that, and usually I think it's about a 10 megahertz range or so. So 444 up to. I'm not sure what the range is off the top of my head, but there are hundreds of frequencies in each of those bands that are available to be used.
So what happens if you go to like 350?
Your radio won't operate there. So it's not only is it not capable, but they're also that's one of the big gripes about Baofengs is they technically can operate outside of the restricted areas, and people don't like that. Because like on FRS, you're not supposed to use more than a watt. And so they can use 5 watts, and that's illegal. So I think the main limitation, though, is in the hardware itself. It's not able to communicate anywhere outside of those 2 bands. And sometimes it's that third one on the 220 that you'll see tri-band on something or quad band. But we're going to stick UHF, VHF for the purpose of today.